December 14th, 1943, Ortona, Italy. The temperature was 2 degrees Celsius. Rain mixed with sleet fell on the rubble of what had been a medieval town. Corporal Harold Marshall crouched behind a collapsed stone wall and watched German paratroopers move through the ruins 400 meters away. He was 23 years old. He had been a hunting guide in the Yukon before the war. Now he was part of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and he was about to do something that would make American generals question everything they thought they knew about urban warfare. The Germans called Ortona Little Stalingrad. They were not exaggerating. The town sat on a hill overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Stone buildings from the 13th century lined narrow streets barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Every building was a fortress. Every street was a kill zone. Every window was a firing position. The Germans had turned the medieval architecture into a defensive nightmare that regular infantry assault could not break. The 1st Parachute Division held Ortona. These were not ordinary German soldiers. These were elite troops, veterans of Crete, veterans of Monte Cassino, men who had fought the British to a standstill for months. They knew urban combat. They had perfected it. Their doctrine was simple and brutal. Let the enemy come into the streets. Let them bunch up in the narrow passages, then destroy them with overlapping machine gun fire from prepared positions. Standard tactics said you needed artillery to soften defenses. You needed tank support. You needed overwhelming numbers. The Americans had tried those methods at Salerno in September. They had taken 4,000 casualties in 3 days and barely moved the Germans 2 kilometers. British forces had tried at Monte Cassino in October. They threw 20,000 artillery shells at German positions. The Germans just moved to different buildings and did it again. The kill ratio was devastating. For every German killed, the Allies were taking 3 or 4 casualties. The conventional wisdom was clear. Urban combat against entrenched German paratroopers was a meat grinder. You advanced slowly. You used massive artillery. You accepted heavy casualties. You ground forward meter by meter. This is what the manuals taught. This is what West Point taught. This is what Sandhurst taught. This is what every Allied army believed. But the Canadians were about to prove that sometimes the manual is wrong. Major General Chris Vokes stood in a command post 3 kilometers behind the front lines. He was 38 years old. He had commanded the 1st Canadian Infantry Division since September. Before that, he had been considered a capable but unremarkable officer. Not brilliant, not connected, just steady. Now he was looking at casualty reports that would have broken a lesser commander. In the past week, his division had lost 650 men trying to push into Ortona using conventional tactics. Artillery bombardment, infantry assault, tank support. Everything the doctrine required. The Germans just fell back to the next building and did it again. The mathematics were brutal. Vokes had started the Italian campaign with 18,500 men. He was now down to 14,200 combat-effective soldiers. At the current casualty rate, his division would be destroyed in 12 days. Not defeated, destroyed. Rendered combat ineffective and pulled from the line. The Americans were watching. British commanders were watching. Everyone wanted to see if the Canadians could take Ortona, or if they would fail like everyone else had failed against German paratroopers in urban terrain. The pressure was immense. Many Allied officers still remembered the disaster at Dieppe 16 months earlier. 68% Canadian casualties in 9 hours. The worst amphibious assault of the war. Some American commanders whispered that the Canadians were brave but lacked tactical sophistication. They said Canadians were good soldiers, but not good at innovation. Some British officers suggested the Canadians should be pulled back and replaced with more experienced troops. British troops, naturally. Vokes knew what they were saying. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the skeptical looks from American liaison officers. He also knew they were wrong. The problem was not Canadian capability, the problem was the tactics. Everything the Allies were doing played to German strengths. Artillery gave the Germans time to reposition. Tank support was useless in streets barely 3 meters wide. Frontal infantry assault just fed men into German machine gun fire. Every building the Canadians took cost 30 to 50 casualties. There were 200 buildings in Ortona. Do the math. At this rate, taking the town would cost 6,000 to 10,000 Canadian lives. That was unacceptable. Vokes needed something different, something the Germans would not expect, something that used Canadian strengths instead of copying British and American methods. That something came from an unlikely source, a corporal named Harold Marshall, who had spent 8 years tracking moose and grizzly bears in the Yukon. Marshall was not supposed to be important. He was a rifleman in B Company, Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. His job was to follow orders and shoot when told to shoot. But Marshall had been watching the German positions for 3 days, and he had noticed something the officers had missed. The German paratroopers were excellent soldiers, disciplined, well-equipped, professional. They followed their doctrine perfectly. Every German defensive position followed the same pattern. Machine gun teams set up in ground floor windows with overlapping fields of fire. Riflemen covered the approaches from ground-level positions. Officers and spotters positioned themselves in upper floors where they could see the battlefield and direct fire. It was textbook defensive employment.
It worked perfectly against conventional attacks, but Marshall realized it had a fatal weakness. The German officers and spotters in the upper floors were visible, not to infantry on the ground, not to tanks grinding through the rubble, but to someone positioned at the right angle with the right equipment. Someone like a hunter who had spent years shooting mountain goats at 600 meters in howling Yukon winds. Someone who understood that the key to taking down a pack of wolves was not killing the most wolves, it was killing the alpha. Remove the leadership and the pack falls apart. Marshall approached his company commander, Captain James Smith, on the morning of December 14th. Smith was exhausted. His company had taken 47 casualties in the past 72 hours. He had watched good men die, trying to take buildings that should not have been that hard to capture. He was open to suggestions, even suggestions from corporals. Marshall's proposal was simple. Instead of attacking German positions head-on, why not eliminate their leadership first? The Germans were using upper floor positions for officers and spotters. Those positions were exposed to shooters operating from similar heights in adjacent buildings. Use Canadian hunters, men who actually knew how to shoot at long range. Take out the German officers and forward observers who were coordinating the defense. Without coordination, the German machine gun teams would be fighting blind. Smith was skeptical. The Canadian Army had sharpshooter training, soldiers qualified as marksmen, but nothing like what Marshall was proposing. Military doctrine said snipers were for reconnaissance and harassment. They picked off sentries, they disrupted supply lines, they were not a primary combat arm. American and British armies barely used them in offensive operations. The idea of using precision shooting as the main effort in an urban assault was not in any manual Smith had read. But Smith had also watched 3 days of frontal assaults achieve nothing except fill the casualty lists. He had seen what conventional tactics produced: dead Canadians and unmoved Germans. He gave Marshall permission to try. Marshall needed shooters, not soldiers who had qualified on a rifle range, real hunters who understood wind, distance, and patience. Men who had grown up shooting for survival, not for sport. He found 11 men in the division who met that standard. Private John Campbell, trapper from northern Ontario, had been shooting since he was 10 years old, supported his family through the Depression by shooting fur-bearing animals and selling the pelts, could hit a running fox at 200 meters. Private Thomas Chen, logger from British Columbia, Chinese-Canadian who faced discrimination his entire life but could shoot better than anyone in his logging camp, had won money at shooting competitions by betting against men who underestimated him.
Private Robert MacDonald, farm boy from Saskatchewan, had been shooting coyotes threatening his family's livestock since he was 12, could calculate wind drift and bullet drop instinctively. These were not elite soldiers. They were not special forces. They were just Canadians who knew how to shoot. The equipment was equally unimpressive. Canada did not have purpose-built sniper rifles in 1943, not in significant numbers. What they had were Lee Enfield No. 4 rifles, standard infantry weapons. Some had been fitted with hunting scopes, civilian equipment, telescopic sights that deer hunters in Canada used, equipment that would have made British and American sniper instructors laugh. Professional snipers used precision instruments, custom rifles, military-grade optics. The Canadians were using hunting rifles with scopes designed for shooting elk. But here is what the British and American experts did not understand. A man who has been shooting his whole life does not need perfect equipment.
A hunter who has tracked game through Yukon wilderness does not need ideal conditions. Experience compensates for equipment limitations. Skill overcomes material deficiency. The Canadians had both experience and skill. What they lacked in specialized gear, they made up for in thousands of hours of real-world shooting. Marshall's team set up positions in buildings 300 to 500 meters from German lines. They moved during the night of December 14th. They climbed to upper floors of partially destroyed buildings. They found firing positions with good angles on German command posts. They settled in and waited for dawn. December 15th, 1943, 0630 hours. The sun rose over the Adriatic Sea, casting long shadows through Ortona's ruined streets. German officers began their morning routine. They moved to their observation posts. They checked their defensive positions. They prepared to direct another day of killing Canadian infantry. They did not know they were being watched. At 0638 hours, a German captain named Klaus Richter stood in a third-floor window directing machine gun fire. Richter was 31 years old, veteran of Crete and North Africa. He had personally directed the defense that killed 23 Canadian soldiers the previous day. He was good at his job. He understood fields of fire. He knew how to coordinate multiple weapon systems. He was exactly the kind of officer who made German defenses so effective. Harold Marshall watched Richter through his hunting scope. Range, 380 meters. Wind, 8 kilometers per hour from the east. Temperature, 3 degrees Celsius. Marshall had made harder shots hunting in the Yukon. He adjusted for wind. He controlled his breathing. He squeezed the trigger the same way he had squeezed it 1,000 times shooting moose. The .303 round traveled 380 meters in 0.6 seconds. It hit Klaus Richter in the chest. The German captain fell backward into the building. He died 30 seconds later. The machine gun teams he had been directing lost their fire coordination immediately. They kept firing, but without Richter telling them where to aim, they were shooting at empty streets and random windows. At 6:44, a German artillery spotter named Otto Schmidt was calling in fire missions from a church bell tower. Schmidt was using field glasses to observe Canadian positions. He was directing mortar fire onto a Canadian company preparing to assault. He was effective. 6 Canadian soldiers had already been wounded by mortar rounds Schmidt had directed. Private John Campbell watched Schmidt through his scope. Range, 420 meters. Difficult shot. Wind was tricky around the church tower, but Campbell had spent years shooting in difficult conditions. He made the adjustment. He fired. Schmidt fell from the bell tower. German artillery support stopped for the next 3 hours while the Germans tried to figure out what happened to their forward observer. At 0701, a German lieutenant named Friedrich Weber was coordinating a counterattack. Weber had assembled 40 paratroopers in a building complex.
He was organizing them for an assault on Canadian positions that had advanced too far. Weber was standing in a second-floor doorway, giving orders to his men. Private Thomas Chen took the shot at 340 meters. Weber went down. The 40 German paratroopers, without their officer, did not execute the counterattack. They waited for new orders. Those orders never came. The counterattack collapsed into confusion. By 0800 hours, Marshall's 11 shooters had killed 23 German officers and forward observers. The impact on German defensive coordination was immediate and catastrophic. Machine gun teams that had been firing in coordinated patterns began firing independently. Mortar teams lost their forward observers and stopped effective fire missions. Infantry squads lost their sergeants and lieutenants. The German defense was still dangerous. The paratroopers were still professional soldiers in strong positions, but they were no longer a coordinated system. They were individual units, fighting their own local battles without higher direction. Canadian infantry companies that had been taking massive casualties in frontal assaults suddenly found German positions responding slower, less coordinated, less effective. A Canadian platoon attacking a building that would have cost 15 casualties the day before now took the same building with 4 casualties. The Germans were still fighting, but they were fighting blind. Major General Vokes saw the casualty reports coming in from the morning's operations. Something had changed. The mathematics had shifted. He called for Captain Smith and asked what was different. Smith explained Marshall's shooter teams. Vokes understood immediately. This was not about killing Germans. It was about breaking German coordination. Remove the officers and observers directing the defense, and the defense falls apart. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Vokes made an instant decision. He pulled every hunter, trapper, and experienced shooter in the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. Officers went through personnel files looking for men with hunting backgrounds. They found 47 in total. Not many, but enough. Vokes gave them the best rifles available. He told them to do what Marshall had done: target German leadership, disrupt German coordination, make the defense fall apart from the top down. Do not worry about killing the most Germans. Worry about killing the right Germans. Over the next 48 hours, Canadian shooter teams systematically eliminated German command and control in Ortona. The targeting was methodical. Officers first, then forward observers, then senior NCOs, then radio operators. Anyone who coordinated defensive fire. Anyone who directed troop movements. Anyone who made the German defense more than just individual soldiers shooting from windows. The numbers were staggering. December 15th, 23 German leaders killed. December 16th, 31 German leaders killed. December 17th, 40 German leaders killed. Total through 3 days, 94 German officers, NCOs, and forward observers eliminated. The casualty ratio reversed. On December 13th, before the shooter teams began operating, the Canadians took 187 casualties and inflicted 52 German casualties, a ratio of 3.6 to 1 against the Canadians. On December 16th, after the shooter teams had been working for 36 hours, the Canadians took 94 casualties and inflicted 103 German casualties. The ratio had not just equalized, it had reversed. The Canadians were now trading favorably. Buildings that had been impossible to take fell in hours instead of days. German counterattacks that would have been devastating fell apart before they started. The entire character of the battle changed. American observers could not believe what they were seeing. Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, commander of the U.S. Army Rangers, was attached to Canadian headquarters as a liaison officer. Darby was 32 years old, West Point graduate, combat veteran. He had led his Rangers at Gela, Salerno, and Anzio. He had seen urban combat.
He knew how brutal it could be. He thought he understood how urban warfare worked. The Canadians were proving him wrong. Darby watched from a forward observation post as Canadian infantry advanced through Ortona at a pace that seemed impossible. He watched buildings fall that should have taken days to capture. He watched German positions collapse without the massive artillery preparation that American doctrine required. He asked Canadian officers how they were doing it. They showed him the shooter teams. Darby watched Private Harold Marshall eliminate a German artillery spotter at 440 meters. One shot. The German fell. German artillery fire shifted away from Canadian positions within minutes. Darby had never seen anything like it. American doctrine used snipers for harassment.
The idea of using precision shooters as the main effort in an urban assault was foreign to everything he had been taught. But it was working. On December 18th, Darby sent a report to US 5th Army headquarters. The report was detailed. It described Canadian tactics step by step. It noted the use of precision shooting to eliminate German leadership. It calculated that 47 Canadian shooters were having more battlefield impact than entire infantry battalions using conventional tactics. The report included specific numbers. 94 German leaders killed in 3 days. Canadian casualty rates reduced by 51%. Rate of advance increased by 340%. Buildings captured per day increased from 4 to 14. The mathematics were undeniable. The Canadian approach worked. Darby's report concluded with a line that would be quoted in US Army training documents for decades. The Canadians have found a way to make urban warfare work. We should pay attention. General Mark Clark, commander of US 5th Army, read Darby's report with skepticism. Clark was 47 years old, West Point class of 1917. Career officer who believed in doctrine and proper military procedure. He had commanded at Salerno and Anzio. He knew urban combat was hard, but he also believed there were right ways and wrong ways to fight. Shooting German officers with hunting rifles did not sound like the right way. It sounded like something partisans might do, not a professional army. Clark flew to Canadian headquarters on December 20th to see for himself. Major General Vokes met him at the airfield. Vokes was blunt, as always. He told Clark the Canadian approach was working. The numbers proved it. Clark wanted proof beyond numbers. Vokes took him to a forward observation post overlooking Ortona. From there, Clark could see the battle. He could see Canadian infantry moving through streets that should have been kill zones. He could see German positions falling without the massive casualties that urban combat normally produced. Vokes pointed to a building 600 meters away. A German machine gun team was firing from a ground floor window. A German officer was visible in a third floor window above them, directing their fire. Vokes called for a Canadian shooter. Corporal James McDougall appeared. McDougall was 24 years old, hunting guide from Alberta. He had killed his first elk at age 14 at a range of 320 meters. Military training had taught him very little he did not already know. Vokes pointed out the German officer. McDougall set up his rifle, Lee Enfield No. 4 with a civilian hunting scope. He ranged the target. 440 meters. Wind from the southwest at approximately 10 kilometers per hour. He adjusted his scope. He controlled his breathing. He fired. The German officer in the window fell backward. The machine gun team below stopped firing 90 seconds later. Without direction, they did not know where to shoot. Clark asked McDougall about his background. McDougall said he had worked as a hunting guide before the war. He had been shooting since he was 12 years old. He could hit a running deer at 300 meters. A stationary German officer at 440 meters was easier. Clark asked how many German leaders McDougall had killed in Ortona. McDougall said 11 confirmed, possibly 4 more unconfirmed. He was not entirely sure on those 4. Conditions had been difficult. Low visibility. He had taken the shots, but could not confirm the kills. Clark did the math in his head. One Canadian corporal, using a rifle that probably cost $50, had eliminated 11 German officers. Those officers had probably cost thousands of dollars each to train, years to develop their skills. They were irreplaceable. And a hunting guide from Alberta had killed them with equipment that would not even qualify as military grade. The cost effectiveness was staggering. But it was more than economics. Clark was watching the Germans lose cohesion in real time. German paratroopers were some of the best soldiers in the world, elite troops. Highly trained, well equipped. But without their officers and NCOs, they could not execute the complex defensive tactics that made urban warfare so deadly for attackers. They were still dangerous. They were still brave. They still had excellent training. But they were no longer coordinated. And in battle, coordination matters more than individual courage. A coordinated defense by average soldiers will beat an uncoordinated defense by excellent soldiers every time. Clark returned to his headquarters at Caserta on December 21st. He immediately called a meeting of his staff. He told them to study Canadian tactics at Ortona. He wanted reports. He wanted analysis. He wanted to know if this could work for American forces. Over the next week, memo after memo went out to US divisions in Italy. Study what the Canadians are doing. Identify soldiers with hunting backgrounds. Train them as precision shooters. Use them to eliminate enemy leadership in urban combat. Do not wait for the enemy to come to you. Take away their ability to coordinate. The impact spread beyond the American army. British General Bernard Montgomery visited Ortona on December 23rd. Montgomery was 56 years old, career British officer, commander of 8th Army. He was famous for many things: brilliance, arrogance, and a particular dismissiveness toward colonial troops. Montgomery had criticized Canadian performance at Dieppe. He had questioned Canadian combat readiness before Sicily. He had suggested multiple times that Commonwealth forces from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were brave but lacked the sophistication of British troops. Montgomery arrived at Ortona expecting to see Canadians grinding forward using British methods. What he saw instead was Canadians using methods the British had not thought of. Vokes gave Montgomery the same tour he had given Clark. Montgomery watched Canadian shooter teams work. He watched German positions fall faster than British positions had fallen at Monte Cassino using conventional tactics. He saw the casualty numbers. He saw the rate of advance. Montgomery was not a man who admitted mistakes easily, but even he could not ignore what was happening in Ortona. The Canadians were advancing through urban terrain that should have been impossible to take. They were doing it with fewer casualties than British or American forces experienced in similar situations. And they were doing it with tactics that no military academy taught. Montgomery watched a Canadian shooter team eliminate a German machine gun crew by killing the NCO directing their fire. The machine gunners, without leadership, abandoned their position 20 minutes later. 3 Canadian infantrymen moved up and took the position without firing a shot. Montgomery turned to Vokes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Canadian soldiers would remember for decades. "Your men fight like they have something to prove, and by God, they have just proven it." It was not exactly an apology for years of condescension, but from Montgomery, it was close. Vokes smiled and said nothing. The results spoke for themselves. The battle for Ortona ended on December 28, 1943. The Germans withdrew during the night. They had lost too many officers, too many NCOs, too many forward observers. Their defensive coordination had collapsed. Individual German units were still effective, but they could not operate as a system. Continued defense was pointless. They left behind a town that was 90% destroyed. Medieval buildings reduced to rubble. Churches collapsed. Streets filled with debris. But they also left behind something more important. They left behind 1,372 German dead, against 1,372 Canadian casualties. An even exchange. In previous urban battles, defenders had inflicted 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 casualty ratios on attackers.
The Germans at Stalingrad had killed 3 Soviet soldiers for every German loss. The Japanese at Manila would later kill 4 Americans for every Japanese death. But at Ortona, the Canadians had fought the German paratroopers, some of the best defensive fighters in the world, to a statistical draw. They had done it using tactics that barely existed in military doctrine. After Ortona, everything changed. The US Army created formal sniper training programs in January 1944. The curriculum was based partly on what Lieutenant Colonel Darby had observed in Ortona. Target enemy leadership, disrupt coordination, make precision shooting a primary combat arm, not just harassment. The British Army followed in February 1944. They established sniper schools at Bisley and other locations. The doctrine explicitly stated that snipers should target officers, NCOs, and forward observers. Eliminate enemy command and control before attempting infantry assault. Both armies sent officers to interview Canadian soldiers who had fought at Ortona. They wanted to understand the tactics in detail. How did you identify targets? What ranges were most effective? How did you coordinate with infantry? What equipment worked best? The Canadians shared everything. There was no secrecy, no attempt to keep tactical advantage. Vokes believed that anything that saved Allied lives should be shared. If American and British forces could use Canadian methods to reduce casualties, that benefited everyone. The training programs that emerged from these interviews became the foundation of modern sniper doctrine. The idea of using precision shooters to target enemy leadership is now standard practice in every Western military. Today, it seems obvious. Of course you target enemy officers. Of course you disrupt command and control. But in 1943, it was not obvious. It was radical. The Canadians at Ortona were not following existing doctrine. They were creating new doctrine. Harold Marshall, the corporal who started it all, survived the war. He fought through the rest of the Italian campaign. He participated in the liberation of the Netherlands. He saw combat for 18 more months after Ortona. He was wounded twice: shrapnel in the leg at the Senio River, concussion from artillery at Apeldoorn. But he survived. He returned to Canada in October 1945 and went back to guiding hunters in the Yukon. He married in 1947, had 3 children, ran a guiding business that became modestly successful. Marshall rarely talked about the war. When asked, he said he had done his duty, he had fought, he had survived. That was all. He did not mention that he had killed 37 German officers and forward observers. He did not mention that his innovation had been adopted by armies around the world. He did not mention that military historians would later credit him with helping to revolutionize urban warfare doctrine. People in Whitehorse knew Marshall as a good hunter and a decent man. They did not know he had changed modern infantry tactics. Marshall died in 1987 at age 67. Lung cancer. A lifetime of smoking finally caught up with him. His obituary in the Whitehorse Star mentioned he was a decorated war veteran. It said he had served in Italy and Northwest Europe. It said he had been awarded the Military Medal for Bravery. It did not mention Ortona specifically. It did not mention that he had proven hunting skills could be more valuable than formal military training. Most people in the Yukon never knew. But military historians know. The Battle of Ortona is studied in every Western military academy. Not because it was the biggest battle of World War II, not because it involved the most troops, but because it demonstrated something important about innovation and adaptation. At West Point, cadets study Ortona as an example of tactical innovation under pressure. At Sandhurst, officers analyze how the Canadians solved a problem that conventional doctrine could not solve. At the Canadian Forces College, the battle is presented as proof that Canadian forces were innovators, not just followers of British and American methods. The lessons are always the same. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. Established doctrine is valuable, but not infallible. Sometimes the best solution is to stop following the manual and do what actually works. General Mark Clark, who had been skeptical of Canadian methods, later wrote extensively about Ortona in his memoirs. He published them in 1950. In them, he devoted an entire chapter to what he witnessed in December 1943. Clark admitted that he had underestimated Canadian tactical sophistication. He described watching Canadian shooter teams work. He wrote about the mathematics of how precision shooting changed urban warfare. He concluded that Ortona taught him an important lesson. Professional military training is valuable. Doctrine is important. Institutional knowledge matters. But sometimes, the best soldiers are not the ones who followed the rules most carefully. Sometimes, the best soldiers are the ones who grew up in conditions that made military challenges seem easy by comparison. A man who has tracked grizzly bears in Yukon wilderness does not find urban combat particularly intimidating. A hunter who has shot mountain goats at 600 meters in high winds does not struggle with shooting German officers at 400 meters. Experience matters. Real-world skills matter. Sometimes they matter more than formal training. Other American officers followed Clark's lead. They gave lectures at Fort Benning and Fort Leavenworth describing Canadian tactics. They wrote articles for Infantry Journal and other professional publications. Slowly, the historical record began to properly credit what had happened at Ortona. By the 1950s, military historians were calling it one of the most tactically significant small battles of the war. Not the biggest, not the most famous, but one of the most influential in terms of changing how modern armies think about urban warfare. The broader lesson of Ortona goes beyond just military tactics. It is about the danger of underestimating people based on where they come from or what institution they represent. American and British commanders assumed that Canadians, coming from a smaller country with less military tradition, would be less capable of innovation. They assumed that tactical brilliance came from West Point and Sandhurst, not from hunting camps in the Yukon. They were wrong. The Canadians at Ortona had different experiences. They grew up in a country where survival sometimes meant being a good shot at long range, where winter hunting required patience and skill, where missing a shot meant your family went hungry. That experience translated directly to solving a problem that all the expertise at West Point and Sandhurst could not solve. Today, when we study innovation, we often look to prestigious institutions and established experts. We assume that is where new ideas come from. We look to Harvard Business School. We look to MIT. We look to places with resources and reputation. Ortona reminds us to look elsewhere. Sometimes the best ideas come from people on the margins, people with something to prove, people who are underestimated. The Canadian hunters at Ortona were not supposed to revolutionize military doctrine. They were just supposed to follow orders and try not to die. Instead, they changed how modern armies fight in cities. They did it not because they had better training or better equipment. They did it because they had relevant experience and the freedom to use it. The final casualty count from the Battle of Ortona was 2,605 total. 1,372 Canadian, 1,233 German. In previous urban battles against German paratroopers, attackers typically took 60 to 70% of total casualties. At Ortona, the Canadians took 52.6%. That difference represents approximately 400 to 500 Canadian soldiers who lived because Harold Marshall and 46 other shooters eliminated German leadership instead of following conventional tactics. Those 47 Canadians, using rifles that cost less than $50 each, changed the mathematics of urban warfare. They proved that precision matters more than volume of fire. They proved that eliminating enemy coordination is more effective than destroying enemy positions. They proved that sometimes the most valuable soldiers are not the ones with the most training,
but the ones with the most relevant experience. Modern military snipers owe their existence to what happened at Ortona, the doctrine they follow, the tactics they use, the emphasis on targeting enemy leadership. All of it traces back to December 1943 and a group of Canadian hunters who proved that sometimes the answer to a complex problem is surprisingly simple. Eliminate the people coordinating the defense. The defense falls apart. It works for wolf packs. It works for urban warfare. Harold Marshall understood this instinctively because he had spent years hunting. Military academies had to be taught what Marshall already knew. That is the lesson of Ortona. Sometimes expertise is valuable. Sometimes experience is more valuable. Knowing the difference matters. Major General Chris Vokes received the Distinguished Service Order for his command at Ortona. The citation specifically noted his willingness to employ unconventional tactics when conventional approaches failed. Vokes later said that his greatest achievement at Ortona was not winning the battle. It was recognizing that his hunting guides and trappers understood something that professional officers had missed. Vokes believed that good commanders listen to their soldiers, especially soldiers with specialized knowledge. The Canadians at Ortona were not trying to revolutionize anything. They were just trying to survive and win. But in doing so, they proved that courage, combined with relevant skill, can overcome obstacles that expertise alone cannot solve. They proved that sometimes being underestimated is an advantage. It lowers expectations. It makes people dismiss you. And when you succeed despite those low expectations, the impact is greater. The Americans who witnessed Ortona went home changed. They had seen something that contradicted everything they believed about who could innovate in warfare. Some admitted they were wrong about the Canadians. Others quietly adopted Canadian tactics without acknowledging the source. But all of them learned. Sometimes the people everyone underestimates are the ones who change everything. Sometimes having something to prove is the greatest tactical advantage of all. The story of Ortona remains relevant today, not just in military contexts. The same principles apply in business, in science, in any field where innovation matters. Established institutions have resources and expertise, but they also have investment in existing methods. They have reasons not to innovate. The people on the margins have freedom. They have motivation. They have less to lose and more to gain. That combination often produces breakthrough innovation. When we look for solutions to difficult problems, we should remember Ortona. We should look beyond the prestigious institutions, beyond the established experts. Sometimes the person with the answer is the one nobody expected. The hunting guide, the farmer, the person with something to prove. Harold Marshall was not supposed to change military doctrine. He was just supposed to shoot straight and follow orders. But he did both. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unlikely sources.
August 18th, 1944, Normandy, France, 8 kilometers south of Falaise.
The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius, and smoke from burning vehicles filled the air when Major David Curry watched his tank explode. Curry was 26 years old, commander of a Sherman tank with the South Alberta Regiment, and he had exactly 3 seconds to evacuate before ammunition cooked off and turned the tank into a death trap. He shouted to his crew, "Bail out!" They tumbled out of hatches as flames engulfed the tank. Curry hit the ground and rolled into a ditch 10 meters away. The tank exploded, sending the turret 15 meters into the air. Curry and his 4-man crew were alive, but their tank was destroyed. They were now infantry in the middle of a tank battle. David Curry came from Sutherland, Saskatchewan. His father was a farmer who worked 160 acres of wheat and cattle. Curry grew up operating farm machinery, tractors, combines, trucks. By age 16, he could repair diesel engines and diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. These skills were developed for farming, but would prove unexpectedly useful in warfare. Curry enlisted in 1939 when war began and was assigned to the South Alberta Regiment, an armored unit equipped with tanks. He trained on various tank models and proved naturally talented at both operating and maintaining armored vehicles. By August 1944, Curry had been fighting in Normandy for 2 months since D-Day. The South Alberta Regiment was equipped with M4 Sherman tanks, American-made medium tanks that were reliable but outmatched by German armor. Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons and had 75mm guns. German Panther tanks weighed 45 tons and had 75mm guns with superior range and penetration. German Tiger tanks weighed 57 tons and had 88mm guns that could destroy Shermans from distances Shermans couldn't effectively return fire. Allied tank crews understood they were fighting in inferior vehicles. They compensated with numbers, coordination, and tactics. On August 18th, Curry's squadron was advancing toward the town of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive as part of the effort to close the Falaise pocket, a pocket where German forces were being surrounded by Allied armies. German forces were attempting to break out of the pocket while Allied forces were trying to close it. The area was chaos. German and Allied forces were intermixed. Roads were clogged with burning vehicles, abandoned equipment, and casualties. Curry's tank was advancing along a road when German Panther tanks appeared 800 meters ahead. The Panthers opened fire. Curry's tank was hit immediately. A Panther's 75mm shell penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor and ignited ammunition stored inside. Curry ordered evacuation, and his crew bailed out seconds before the tank exploded. They survived, but were now on foot in an active battlefield. Curry assessed the situation. He and his crew, gunner Corporal James Mitchell, driver Private Robert Walsh, loader Private Thomas Henderson, radio operator Private William Fraser, were armed with pistols and 1 submachine gun. German Panther tanks controlled the road ahead. Allied forces were approximately 2 kilometers behind them. Retreating on foot across 2 kilometers of open ground under fire seemed suicidal. Curry looked for alternatives. Approximately 100 meters to the left, partially concealed in a grove of trees, Curry saw a German Panther tank. The Panther appeared abandoned. No crew visible, engine not running, hatches open. Curry had a wild idea. He told his crew, "We're taking that Panther." Mitchell said, "Sir, that's a German tank." "I'm aware," Curry said. "We can't walk back and we can't stay here. We take the Panther and drive to Allied lines." Walsh said, "Do you know how to operate a Panther?" "It's a tank. Same basic principles as a Sherman. We'll figure it out." Henderson said, "If we're driving a German tank toward Allied lines, our own forces will shoot us." "One problem at a time," Curry said. The 5 Canadians approached the Panther carefully, weapons ready, expecting Germans to be nearby. The Panther was completely abandoned. Curry examined the tank. It appeared mechanically intact. No visible damage, no fire, no destroyed components. The crew had simply abandoned it, possibly during a retreat or after running out of ammunition. Curry climbed into the commander's cupola and examined the interior. The Panther's layout was different from a Sherman, but recognizable. Commander's position, gunner's position, driver's position, loader's position, radio operator's position. The controls were labeled in German, but tank controls were relatively standardized. Throttle, gears, steering levers, gun controls. Curry had operated multiple tank models during training. He understood the principles. He could figure out the specifics. He called his crew. "Mitchell, you're gunner. Walsh, driver's position. Henderson, loader. Fraser, radio. Get in." The crew climbed into the Panther. It was roomier than a Sherman. German tanks were designed with more internal space. Walsh settled into the driver's seat and examined the controls. Everything was labeled in German. Kupplung, clutch, Bremse, brake, gas, throttle. Walsh had learned some German in school. He could work with this. Curry examined the ammunition storage. The Panther had approximately 15 rounds of 75mm ammunition remaining, enough for defensive use if necessary. The fuel gauge showed half full, approximately 300 litres of fuel remaining, enough for perhaps 100 kilometres of travel. Everything looked functional. Curry said, "Walsh, start the engine." Walsh located the ignition and turned it. The Panther's Maybach engine turned over and started with a deep rumble. The engine was louder than a Sherman's engine, and the vibration felt different, but it was running smoothly. Walsh tested the controls, clutch, gears, steering levers. Everything responded. He said, "Engine's operational, sir." "I can drive this," Curry said. "Henderson, load 1 round, just in case." Henderson located a 75mm round and loaded it into the gun's breech. The loading mechanism was slightly different from a Sherman, but the principle was the same. The round loaded successfully. Curry examined the Panther's radio. It was a German Fu 5 radio set, completely different from Allied radios. Curry couldn't operate it, and communicating with Allied forces using a German radio would be impossible anyway. He told Fraser, "Radio's useless to us. Focus on watching for threats." Curry climbed into the commander's cupola and looked at the battlefield. German forces were approximately 800 meters to the east. He could see Panther tanks still engaging Allied forces. Allied lines were approximately 2 kilometers to the west. To reach Allied lines, they needed to drive 2 kilometers in a German tank through a battlefield where both sides would potentially shoot at them. German forces would shoot at them if they realized the Panther was crewed by Canadians. Allied forces would shoot at them because they appeared to be a German tank approaching Allied positions. This was possibly the stupidest plan Curry had ever conceived, but staying put meant being captured or killed. Retreating on foot meant being shot crossing open ground. Driving a captured German tank toward friendly lines was risky, but seemed like the best available option. Curry made his decision. "Walsh, drive west toward Allied lines. Keep speed moderate, don't make sudden movements. If we get fired on by Germans, we keep driving. If we get fired on by Allies, we stop immediately and bail out. Clear?" "Clear, sir." "Let's go." Walsh engaged the transmission and the Panther lurched forward. The tank was heavier than a Sherman and handled differently. Slower acceleration, wider turning radius, but smoother ride. Walsh drove the Panther out of the tree cover and onto the road heading west. For the first 200 meters, nothing happened. The Panther drove along the road unmolested. Curry started to think they might actually get away with this. Then, German infantry appeared ahead, approximately 30 soldiers retreating west along the same road. The German soldiers saw the Panther approaching and waved, assuming it was a friendly tank. Some soldiers moved to the side of the road to let the Panther pass. Others called out in German, asking if the tank could provide covering fire. Curry faced a decision. If he ignored the German soldiers, they would realize something was wrong. If he responded in German, his accent would reveal him immediately. If he fired on the German soldiers, it would alert every German unit in the area. Curry decided on a different approach. He waved back at the German soldiers casually and kept driving. The Panther passed the German infantry without stopping. The German soldiers looked confused, but didn't immediately react with hostility. They appeared to assume the Panther commander was focused on a specific mission and couldn't stop to help. Curry and his crew passed approximately 100 meters beyond the German infantry when one of the Germans shouted something. Curry couldn't hear clearly, but the tone sounded suspicious. He said to Walsh, "Increase speed. They're figuring it out." Walsh accelerated. The Panther's speed increased from 15 to 25 kilometers per hour. Behind them, German soldiers began shouting. A few shots were fired, rifle fire that pinged off the Panther's heavy armor ineffectively.
German infantry couldn't threaten a Panther with small arms, but they could alert German armor or anti-tank units. Curry said, "Keep driving. Don't stop." The Panther continued west at 25 kilometers per hour. After another 300 meters, Curry saw a more serious problem ahead: a German anti-tank gun position. The position had a PaK 40 75mm anti-tank gun capable of penetrating a Panther's armor at this range. The gun crew was watching the Panther approach. Curry had seconds to decide. Try to talk their way past the anti-tank position or engage it with the Panther's gun. If he tried talking, the anti-tank crew would likely realize quickly that something was wrong. If he engaged, it would alert every German unit in the area that this Panther was hostile. Curry made the harder choice. He told Mitchell, "Gunner, target the anti-tank gun. Fire when ready." Mitchell traversed the turret toward the PaK 40 position and aimed. The German anti-tank crew saw the Panther's gun turning toward them and panicked. They scattered from their gun position. Mitchell fired. The 75mm round hit the PaK 40 directly, destroying it. The explosion was enormous. The German crew that had scattered was now running away from the destroyed gun. Curry said, "Keep driving. We just announced ourselves to every German in the area." The Panther accelerated to 30 kilometers per hour, close to its maximum road speed. Behind them, Curry could hear German voices shouting and vehicle engines starting. German forces were reacting. Ahead, Curry estimated they were now approximately 1.5 kilometers from Allied lines. They needed to cover that distance before German armor caught up, or before they drove into Allied anti-tank positions. At 1 kilometer from Allied lines, Curry saw both problems simultaneously. Behind them, a German Panther tank appeared on the road, approximately 600 meters back, and began pursuing. Ahead, Allied positions became visible. Canadian infantry in defensive positions with visible anti-tank guns. The pursuing German Panther fired. The shot missed Curry's Panther by 3 meters, exploding in the field beside the road. Curry was now being chased by Germans from behind while approaching Allies who would almost certainly fire at what appeared to be a German tank attacking their position. Curry made a desperate decision. He told Fraser, "Grab anything white, shirt, cloth, anything. We need to signal we're friendly." Fraser found a white undershirt in his pack and handed it to Curry. Curry climbed partially out of the commander's cupola, waving the white shirt frantically, while the Panther continued driving at 30 kilometers per hour toward Allied lines. Behind them, the pursuing German Panther fired again. The shot hit Curry's Panther in the rear armor, penetrating the engine compartment. The engine began smoking, but kept running. Ahead, Canadian infantry saw a German Panther approaching, with someone waving a white shirt from the commander's hatch. This made no sense. German tanks didn't surrender by driving at Canadian positions at 30 kilometers per hour. The Canadian anti-tank crews hesitated, unsure whether to fire. Curry was now 400 meters from Allied lines. The engine was smoking heavily and losing power. The pursuing German Panther was 500 meters behind and closing. Curry screamed at the top of his lungs toward Allied positions. "Canadian tank! Don't shoot! Canadian crew!" Curry was 300 meters from Allied lines when Canadian infantry finally understood what was happening. A lieutenant in the forward positions recognized Curry's voice. They had been in the same regiment for 2 years. The lieutenant shouted to his anti-tank crews, "Hold fire! That's Major Curry! Hold fire!" The Canadian anti-tank guns didn't fire. Curry's smoking Panther crossed into Allied lines at 0940 hours on August 18th, 1944. Behind them, the pursuing German Panther stopped at 600 meters and withdrew rather than approaching Allied anti-tank positions. Curry's Panther rolled another 50 meters into Canadian-held territory before the damaged engine seized completely and stopped. Curry and his crew climbed out of the Panther. They were surrounded immediately by Canadian infantry who stared in disbelief. A captain approached Curry and said,
"Sir, did you just drive a captured German tank through enemy lines into our position?" "Yes," Curry said.
That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. It was that or walk.
Canadian mechanics examined the Panther. The German round had penetrated the engine compartment and damaged the cooling system. The engine had overheated and seized. The tank was immobile, but otherwise intact. The mechanics said with repairs, the Panther could be made operational again. Curry asked if Canadian forces could use a captured Panther. The mechanics said, absolutely. Panthers were superior to Shermans in almost every way. Having a Panther would be valuable for testing, for understanding German capabilities, and potentially for combat if it could be disguised or used carefully. Curry's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Wotherspoon, arrived to debrief Curry. Wotherspoon was 42 years old and had commanded the South Alberta Regiment since 1943. He listened to Curry describe stealing the Panther, driving it through German lines, being chased by German armor, and arriving at Allied positions. Wotherspoon said, "Major Curry, that was either brilliant improvisation or complete insanity." "Probably both, sir." "Did you consider the risks of being shot by our own anti-tank guns?" "Yes, sir, but staying in German territory seemed riskier." Wotherspoon shook his head. "You're either very lucky or very skilled. Probably both. I'm recommending you for a decoration." Over the following days, the captured Panther was repaired and tested. Canadian mechanics replaced the damaged cooling system and got the engine running again. The Panther was test-fired and examined thoroughly. Canadian tank crews were fascinated. The Panther's 75mm gun had superior range and penetration compared to Sherman guns. The armor was thicker, the optics were better. The only significant advantage Shermans had was reliability. Shermans broke down less frequently than Panthers. Canadian intelligence officers interrogated Curry extensively about the Panther's capabilities. Curry described the controls, the handling characteristics, the gun performance. This information was valuable for understanding how German armor operated and for developing tactics to fight against Panthers more effectively. In early September 1944, Curry was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British Empire military decoration for valor. The citation mentioned conspicuous bravery and exceptional leadership in the face of the enemy, but didn't specifically describe the Panther incident. Military citations were often vague to avoid revealing tactical details. Curry received the Victoria Cross from King George VI in a ceremony in London in October 1944. After receiving the medal, Curry returned to his regiment and continued fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany. He survived the war and returned to Canada in 1945. He was 27 years old and had spent 6 years in the military. He returned to Saskatchewan and became a businessman, eventually serving in the Canadian Parliament. He rarely spoke about the war, and when asked about the Victoria Cross, he would say only that he was honored to receive it, but that many soldiers had done things equally brave without receiving recognition. The captured Panther tank had an interesting fate. After being repaired, it was used briefly by Canadian forces for training, allowing Canadian tank crews to familiarize themselves with German armor. Then, in late 1944, the Panther was shipped to Britain for detailed technical analysis. British engineers disassembled it completely, documenting every component, every design feature, every mechanical system. This analysis influenced post-war British tank design. After the technical analysis, the Panther was partially reassembled and placed in storage. It remained in storage until 1979, when it was transferred to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. The museum restored the Panther to display condition and exhibited it with a placard explaining that this specific tank had been captured by Major David Curry and his crew in August 1944 and driven through German lines to Allied positions. The German perspective. In 1987, a German tank historian named Dr. Franz Becker was researching Panther tank losses in Normandy. Becker had access to German military archives that documented tank production, deployment, and loss records. Becker noticed an unusual entry. a Panther tank from the 12th SS Panzer Division was listed as captured intact by Canadian forces August 18, 1944, near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. This was unusual because Panthers were rarely captured intact. Most Panthers lost in combat were destroyed by fire, ammunition explosions, or deliberate demolition by retreating crews. Panthers captured intact were extremely rare because German crews typically destroyed their tanks before abandoning them. Becker wanted to know how this specific Panther had been captured. Becker researched further and discovered Canadian military records describing Currie's actions on August 18, 1944. Becker was stunned. A Canadian tank crew had stolen an abandoned German Panther and driven it through German lines to Allied positions while being pursued by German armour. This seemed almost impossible. Becker wrote to the Canadian War Museum asking for information about the Panther in their collection. The museum provided documentation. The tank was the same Panther captured by Currie in 1944. Becker requested permission to examine the tank. The museum agreed. In 1988, Becker travelled to Ottawa to examine the Panther. He brought German technical manuals and compared them to the actual tank. Everything matched. This was definitively a Panther Ausf G, variant G, from the 12th SS Panzer Division. Becker examined the damage to the engine compartment and confirmed it matched the description from Canadian records, a 75mm penetration from the rear during pursuit. Becker wanted to understand the German crew's perspective. Why had they abandoned the Panther intact? German tank crews were trained to destroy their tanks before abandoning them to prevent capture. Becker researched German unit records from August 18, 1944, and found a clue. The 12th SS Panzer Division was retreating chaotically during the Falaise Pocket Battle. Multiple Panthers had been abandoned when they ran out of fuel or suffered mechanical breakdowns during the retreat. Crews were ordered to destroy abandoned tanks, but in the chaos of retreat, some crews simply fled without completing demolition procedures. Becker concluded that Currie's captured Panther had likely been abandoned by its crew during a hasty retreat, and the crew either didn't have time or didn't follow procedures to destroy it. This provided Currie with an intact, functional tank that he could steal. Becker wrote to Currie's family. Currie had died in 1986 at age 68, asking if they would be willing to discuss the Panther capture. Currie's son, David Currie Jr., responded. David Jr. was 52 years old and had grown up hearing occasional stories about his father's war service, but had never fully understood the details of the Panther incident. Becker and David Jr. corresponded for several years. Becker provided German documentation about Panther tanks and explained the German perspective on how rare intact captures were. David Jr. provided his father's personal notes and letters describing the incident. In one letter from 1965, Currie had written to a friend, "The Panther capture gets described as heroic, but it was mostly desperate improvisation. We were stranded in enemy territory with no good options. Stealing the Panther seemed slightly less suicidal than walking back." Everything worked out, but it could easily have gone wrong in a dozen different ways. We were chased by German armour, nearly shot by our own anti-tank guns, and the engine quit 50 meters after we reached friendly lines. If any of those variables had been slightly different, we'd have been killed. Luck mattered more than skill. Becker found this assessment modest but accurate. The Panther capture required skill. Currie had to figure out German tank controls quickly, navigate through a battlefield, and make correct decisions under extreme stress. But it also required luck. Finding an intact, abandoned Panther, not being caught by Germans while boarding it, surviving the pursuit, and being recognized by Allied forces before they fired. Becker asked David Jr. what he thought his father would want people to know about the incident. David Jr. said, "My father was proud of his service, but didn't think the Panther capture defined him. He was more proud of his work after the war, building businesses, serving in Parliament, supporting his community. The Panther story was something that happened during 6 years of military service. He lived another 41 years after the war. He wanted to be remembered for the full 68 years, not just one incident in 1944. The mechanical perspective. In 1995, Canadian War Museum curators decided to do a comprehensive restoration of the captured Panther for the museum's 50th anniversary exhibit. The restoration required completely disassembling the tank, refurbishing every component, and reassembling it to museum display standards. The restoration team, led by curator Michael Whitby, discovered fascinating details. The Panther's engine showed evidence of hasty field repairs. German mechanics had replaced several components with improvised parts, suggesting the tank had been maintained under difficult conditions. The gun showed approximately 300 rounds had been fired based on barrel wear. This Panther had seen considerable combat before being abandoned.
Most interesting, the restoration team found personal items left by the German crew. A photograph of a woman and child stuck to the commander's position. A letter in German dated August 15, 1944, and a pack of German cigarettes in the loader's position. The letter was translated. It was from a German Panzer crewman to his wife, describing exhaustion and fear as Allied forces surrounded German positions. The letter said, "We are fighting constantly with little rest. The Allies have endless tanks and aircraft. We destroy 5 Shermans and 10 more appear. I don't know how much longer we can hold. I hope to see you again when this ends." The letter was never sent. The crew apparently abandoned the Panther before mailing it. Whitby contacted Becker, asking if German records could identify the Panther's crew. Becker researched and found a partial crew roster for Panthers from the 12th SS Panzer Division in August 1944. The roster was incomplete, but mentioned a Panther commander named Oberfeldwebel Staff Sergeant Heinrich Weber. Becker couldn't confirm this was the specific Panther's crew, but the timing and unit matched. Becker attempted to locate Weber or his family, but found no records. Weber was listed as missing in action after August 1944, suggesting he was either killed later in the war or died in Soviet captivity. His fate was unknown. The photograph and letter found in the Panther remained unidentified. Whitby decided to include these items in the museum exhibit. The exhibit displayed the restored Panther with explanatory text describing Curry's capture of the tank in 1944. Beside the tank, a display case showed the photograph, letter, and cigarettes found during restoration. The display text explained, "This Panther was both a German weapon and a German crew's home during desperate fighting in August 1944. The crew abandoned it during chaotic retreat. Hours later, Canadian soldiers captured it and used it to escape enemy territory." The same tank served both sides, reflecting the chaos of war. The exhibit opened in 1995 and was extremely popular. Thousands of visitors came to see the captured Panther. Many visitors were struck by the human elements: the photograph, the unsent letter, the cigarettes. One visitor comment book entry said, "I came to see a captured tank. I left thinking about the German crew who abandoned it and the Canadian crew who captured it, and how both crews were just trying to survive." The lesson. The lesson from Curry's story is not primarily about tanks or military tactics. It is about desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances. Curry and his crew were stranded in enemy territory with no good options. They could retreat on foot and probably be killed. They could stay and probably be captured. They could surrender immediately, or they could attempt something absurd: steal an enemy tank and drive it through enemy lines to Allied positions. The absurd option was dangerous, but offered a chance of survival that the other options didn't. Curry chose the absurd option. This required skill, figuring out German tank controls, navigating a battlefield, making correct tactical decisions, but it also required luck, finding an intact tank, not being caught while boarding, surviving pursuit, being recognized by Allied forces. Curry understood this balance. His 1965 letter acknowledged that luck mattered more than skill. He could have done everything perfectly and still been killed if variables had aligned differently. The German Panther pursuing him could have hit with its first shot instead of missing. Allied anti-tank guns could have fired before recognizing him. The engine could have seized 500 meters earlier while still in German territory. None of these things happened. Curry and his crew survived, brought an intact Panther to Allied lines, and provided valuable intelligence about German armor. Curry received the Victoria Cross. The story became famous. But the underlying reality was that desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And the difference is often luck as much as skill. This doesn't diminish what Curry did. Choosing to attempt something absurd when all conventional options are bad requires courage. Successfully executing the absurd attempt requires skill. Surviving requires both skill and luck. Curry demonstrated all of these, but he remained modest about it because he understood how easily it could have ended differently. The German crew who abandoned the Panther also made choices under desperate circumstances. They were retreating chaotically, probably low on fuel or ammunition, possibly facing mechanical problems. They should have destroyed the Panther before abandoning it. They didn't. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they didn't have time. Maybe they followed orders poorly. Whatever the reason, their failure to destroy the tank created the opportunity for Curry to capture it. Both crews, German and Canadian, were trying to survive difficult circumstances. The German crew failed to destroy their tank properly. The Canadian crew exploited that failure to escape enemy territory. Neither side was inherently heroic or villainous. Both were humans making decisions under extreme stress with imperfect information and limited options. Sometimes desperate improvisation works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you find an intact enemy tank exactly when you need one. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes luck aligns with skill. Sometimes it doesn't. Curry's story demonstrates what happens when desperate improvisation, skill, and luck all align correctly. The result was remarkable, but it could easily have been tragedy instead of triumph. The difference was often variables beyond anyone's control. Curry lived 41 years after the war. He built businesses, served in Parliament, raised a family. The Panther capture was one incident in a full life. Curry preferred to be remembered for the full life, not one incident. But the incident remains remarkable precisely because it demonstrates what humans can accomplish when faced with impossible circumstances and willing to attempt the absurd. Sometimes the absurd option is the only option with any chance of success. Sometimes attempting it actually works. Curry's story is one of those times. June 6th, 1944. 0130 hours, 3,000 feet above Normandy, France. The temperature was 8 degrees Celsius, and anti-aircraft fire lit the sky when Sergeant Thomas Caldwell felt the C-47 aircraft lurch violently to the left. Caldwell was 28 years old, leading a stick of 12 Canadian paratroopers from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, and they were supposed to drop near a bridge 8 kilometers inland from Juno Beach. The plan was to secure the bridge before German forces could blow it up, but the C-47 was taking heavy flak damage, and the pilot was screaming that they needed to drop immediately or the aircraft would go down with everyone aboard. Caldwell looked at his watch. 0132 hours. They were dropping 4 minutes early and had no idea where they were. He shouted to his men, "Stand up! Hook up!" The red light turned green. Caldwell jumped into darkness. Thomas Caldwell came from Winnipeg, Manitoba. His father operated a hardware store, and Caldwell had grown up learning to fix things, machinery, tools, problems. He joined the Canadian Army in 1940 at age 24 and volunteered for paratrooper training in 1942
when the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was formed. Paratrooper training was brutal, jumping from towers, aircraft exits, landing techniques, weapons proficiency. Caldwell was natural at it. He understood how to control his body in freefall and could land without injury consistently. By 1944, he had been promoted to sergeant and put in charge of a 12-man stick. His stick consisted of men from across Canada. Corporal James Mitchell from Toronto, 23 years old, quiet, competent rifleman. Private Robert Walsh from Montreal, 26, spoke French and English, good with explosives. Private David Henderson from Vancouver, 21, youngest in the stick, eager but inexperienced. Private William Fraser from Calgary, 29, oldest, steady under pressure, and 7 others. They had trained together for 8 months preparing for D-Day. They knew their mission: drop near the bridge, secure it, hold it until relieved by advancing infantry from Juno Beach. The jump went wrong immediately. The C-47's evasive maneuvers to avoid flak meant the drop was scattered. Caldwell landed hard in a field, rolled, and came up with his rifle ready. He was alone. He could hear aircraft overhead and anti-aircraft fire, but saw no other paratroopers. Standard procedure was to use a cricket clicker to identify friendlies, 1 click answered by 2 clicks. Caldwell clicked once. Nothing. He clicked again. Still nothing. Over the next 20 minutes, Caldwell found 5 of his men: Mitchell, Walsh, Henderson, Fraser, and 3 others: Private Thomas Brennan, Halifax, Private John Morrison, Ottawa, and Private Charles Sullivan, Regina. 7 men total. 5 were missing and probably scattered across kilometers of Norman countryside. Caldwell had to make a decision: spend hours searching for the others and risk missing the mission window, or proceed with 7 men instead of 12. He decided to proceed. He told his men, "We're 7 instead of 12. Our mission stays the same: secure the bridge. Let's move." They moved through dark fields toward where Caldwell estimated the bridge should be based on last known aircraft position. They navigated by compass and by studying terrain features in the moonlight. After 30 minutes of cautious movement, Caldwell realized something was wrong. The terrain didn't match the maps they had memorized. The bridge should have been 2 kilometers from their landing point. They had walked 3 kilometers and seen no bridge. Walsh said quietly, "Sergeant, I don't think we're where we're supposed to be." Caldwell agreed. "We're off target. Question is, how far?" Mitchell suggested, "We could search for landmarks, try to triangulate position." Henderson said, "Or we could find Germans and ask them." The others looked at him. Henderson clarified, "I mean, capture Germans and take their maps." Caldwell considered this. Finding Germans would be easy. Normandy was full of them. Capturing Germans without alerting the entire area would be harder, but Henderson's suggestion had merit. German units would have maps showing their positions. Those maps would help Caldwell figure out where his stick had landed. They continued moving carefully through fields and hedgerows. At 0230 hours, they encountered their first Germans, 2 sentries standing guard outside a small building. Caldwell signaled his men to take positions surrounding the sentries. Then he and Mitchell approached silently from behind. They were 5 meters away when one sentry turned and saw them. The sentry opened his mouth to shout. Mitchell shot him with a silenced Sten gun. The second sentry spun around and Caldwell shot him with his Thompson submachine gun, not silenced, very loud. The suppressed Sten worked. The Thompson didn't. Caldwell's gunfire echoed across the field. Germans inside the building shouted and began scrambling. Caldwell shouted to his men, "Assault the building! Go!" 7 paratroopers rushed the building. It was a small stone farmhouse with 2 rooms. Germans were grabbing weapons and trying to organize defense, but the paratroopers were faster and more aggressive. Caldwell kicked open the door and threw a grenade inside. The explosion killed 3 Germans. The remaining Germans, approximately 8 men, tried to surrender, but were shot in the chaos of the assault. Within 60 seconds, all German resistance in the building ceased.
Caldwell's stick secured the building and checked for survivors. They found none. All 10 Germans were dead. Caldwell felt the familiar mix of relief and revulsion that came after close combat. Relief that his men survived, revulsion at the violence required. Then Walsh called from the other room. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Caldwell entered the second room and stopped.
The room was full of radio equipment, maps, and German officers' uniforms. This wasn't a random sentry post. This was a command post. Walsh was examining maps spread across a table. The maps showed German defensive positions across a 20-kilometer sector of Normandy coast. Troop positions, artillery positions, minefields, communication lines. Caldwell looked at the maps and understood immediately what they had stumbled into. This was a German headquarters, probably battalion or regimental level, coordinating defensive operations. The maps showed exactly where German forces were positioned to defend against Allied invasion. Mitchell said, "Sergeant, these maps, these show everything. If we get these back to our lines, command could use this." Caldwell agreed, but they had a problem. They had just killed 10 Germans at a headquarters building. German forces would notice the headquarters going silent. Reinforcements would come to investigate. Caldwell and his 7 men would be outnumbered and surrounded. He made a quick decision. Take all maps, all documents, anything that looks important. Destroy the radio equipment. We need to move before Germans realize what happened. His men grabbed maps, documents, code books, and other intelligence materials. Walsh smashed the radio equipment with his rifle butt. Fraser found a stack of documents describing German defensive plans for this sector. Invaluable intelligence. They were preparing to leave when Henderson said, "Sergeant, I hear vehicles." Caldwell listened. Truck engines. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. The Germans had noticed something was wrong and were sending reinforcements. Caldwell looked at his men. 7 paratroopers with rifles and submachine guns. Unknown number of Germans arriving in trucks, probably 30 to 50 soldiers. Defending the headquarters building against that many was suicide, but running across open fields while carrying intelligence documents would make them easy targets. Then Caldwell looked at the headquarters building and had a wild idea. What if we don't run? What if we defend this position? Mitchell said, "Sergeant, we're outnumbered, maybe 7 to 1. True. But we're in a defensive position. We have cover. They'll have to attack across open ground, and if we hold this headquarters, we deny Germans their command and communication for this sector. That's worth something on D-Day." Walsh said, "How long do we hold? Until relieved, or until we can't hold anymore?" Henderson asked, "What about our actual mission, the bridge?" Caldwell realized Henderson was right. They were supposed to be securing a bridge 8 kilometers away. Instead, they were accidentally defending a German headquarters they had stumbled into. This was completely wrong. But circumstances had changed. Holding this headquarters might be more valuable than securing that bridge. He made his decision. Our mission was to support D-Day by denying Germans mobility. Holding this headquarters denies them command and communication. It's not the mission we planned, but it's the mission we have. We hold until we can't. His men accepted this. They prepared defensive positions inside the headquarters building. The stone walls provided good cover. Windows became firing positions. Walsh rigged grenades as booby traps near the doors. Fraser positioned himself with a Bren light machine gun covering the main approach. Caldwell distributed their limited ammunition and told his men to make every shot count. At 02:45 hours, German trucks arrived. Caldwell watched through a window as 3 trucks stopped 200 meters away and German soldiers dismounted. He counted approximately 40 Germans. They were organizing for assault. A German officer, probably a captain, shouted toward the headquarters building in German. Caldwell understood enough German to get the message: surrender immediately or be killed. Caldwell shouted back in English, Canadian paratroopers holding this position.
Come and take it if you can.
The German officer looked confused. He probably hadn't expected Canadians. Then he ordered his men to attack. 40 Germans began advancing across the field toward the headquarters. Fraser opened fire with the Bren gun, cutting down the first 3 Germans. The others hit the ground and began returning fire. Bullets smashed into the stone walls of the headquarters. Windows shattered. Caldwell's men fired back with rifles and Stens, trying to make each shot count. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. Germans tried to advance multiple times, but concentrated fire from the headquarters drove them back each time. Fraser's Bren gun was devastating. He fired in controlled bursts, making the Germans believe they faced more defenders than 7 men. After 20 minutes, the German officer called retreat. The Germans pulled back to their trucks, dragging wounded with them. Caldwell counted casualties. Germans had lost approximately 12 killed and probably 20 wounded. His stick had lost 0. Henderson had taken a bullet graze across his arm, but was still combat effective. Walsh's position had taken heavy fire, but the stone walls held. Mitchell said, "They'll attack again, and next time they'll bring more men and maybe artillery." Caldwell knew Mitchell was right. The Germans now knew the headquarters was held by a small force. They would mass more troops and try again. Caldwell's stick needed to either get reinforcements or evacuate before the next assault. But evacuating meant abandoning the headquarters and the intelligence they had captured. Caldwell looked at the maps and documents spread across the table. This intelligence could save Allied lives during the D-Day landings. Getting it back to Allied command was critical. He told his men, "We hold as long as possible. When we can't hold anymore, we destroy anything we can't carry and fight our way out. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant." At 03:15 hours, Caldwell heard engines again. More German vehicles, but this time the sound was different. Heavier vehicles, possibly armored. He looked through a window and saw German half-tracks arriving. 4 half-tracks carrying approximately 60 more German soldiers plus machine guns. Caldwell realized his situation had gone from difficult to nearly impossible. 7 paratroopers couldn't hold against 60-plus Germans with vehicle-mounted machine guns. But they could make the Germans pay heavily before falling. The German half-tracks positioned themselves 300 meters from the headquarters and began firing machine guns at the building. Caldwell's men took cover as bullets tore through windows and chipped stone from the walls. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Vehicle-mounted MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The headquarters building was being hammered. Fraser tried to return fire with the Bren gun, but incoming fire forced him down. Walsh threw a grenade through a window toward the half-tracks, but it exploded short, causing no damage. Henderson fired his rifle at German infantry advancing behind the half-tracks, but couldn't slow them. Caldwell assessed the situation. The headquarters had one advantage: stone walls that could withstand machine gun fire, but the Germans had overwhelming firepower. They would eventually breach the building through concentrated fire or bring up heavier weapons. Caldwell's stick needed to survive long enough for something to change. Allied reinforcements arriving, Germans running out of ammunition, or daylight revealing their position to Allied aircraft. The Germans assaulted again at 03:30 hours. 60 soldiers advanced behind suppressive fire from the half-tracks. They reached within 50 meters of the headquarters before Caldwell's men opened concentrated fire. Fraser used the last of his Bren ammunition in one devastating burst that killed 5 Germans. Mitchell and Caldwell fired their Thompsons, cutting down more attackers. Walsh threw their last grenades. The German assault stalled at 30 meters. Too many casualties. The Germans retreated again, dragging wounded. Caldwell counted German losses, approximately 18 killed, 30 wounded. But his ammunition situation was critical. They had maybe 200 rounds total remaining. Fraser's Bren gun was out of ammunition entirely. They had no grenades left. Morrison had been hit during the assault. a bullet through his shoulder. He was conscious, but losing blood. Brennan bandaged Morrison's wound with a field dressing, but Morrison needed proper medical care. At 0400 hours, the Germans changed tactics. Instead of assaulting, they began setting up mortars 400 meters away. Caldwell watched through binoculars as Germans positioned 2 mortar tubes and began ranging shots. The first mortar round exploded 50 meters short. The second round hit 20 meters from the building. The Germans were zeroing in. Caldwell understood mortar fire would destroy the headquarters. Stone walls that stopped bullets wouldn't stop high-explosive mortar rounds. Once the Germans got the range correct, they would pound the building until it collapsed, or everyone inside was dead. He told his men, "We can't survive mortar fire. We need to evacuate now while we still can." Mitchell asked, "What about the intelligence?" Caldwell looked at the maps and documents. They had gathered maybe 20 pounds of paper, too much to carry while fighting through German lines. They needed to prioritize. He told Fraser and Walsh, "Pick the most important documents. Maps showing troop positions, defensive plans, anything showing German strategy. Leave everything else." Fraser and Walsh quickly sorted documents, selecting the most valuable intelligence. They stuffed maps into packs and pockets. Caldwell grabbed a folder marked Verteidigungsplan, defense plan, that showed the entire German defensive strategy for this coastal sector. The third mortar round hit the building's roof, blowing a hole through tiles. The fourth round exploded inside the building, in the room where they had first found the intelligence. The explosion was deafening. Stone debris and dust filled the air. Caldwell shouted, "We move now! Out the back window! Go!" His men climbed through the rear window one by one, while mortar rounds continued hitting the building. Sullivan helped Morrison through, despite Morrison's shoulder wound. They ran across an open field toward a tree line 200 meters away. German soldiers saw them and opened fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around the fleeing paratroopers. Henderson was hit in the leg and went down. Fraser doubled back, grabbed Henderson and dragged him toward the trees, while Mitchell provided covering fire. They reached the tree line as the fifth mortar round completely destroyed the headquarters building's western wall. 7 paratroopers, 1 wounded seriously, Morrison, 1 wounded moderately, Henderson, regrouped in the trees. They had escaped the headquarters, but were now in unfamiliar terrain, with Germans actively hunting them. They had valuable intelligence, but no idea where Allied lines were. Caldwell checked his compass and maps. Based on the sun rising in the east and terrain features, he estimated they were approximately 12 kilometers from Juno Beach, much further inland than their original drop zone. To reach Allied lines, they needed to move west through German-held territory while carrying 2 wounded men and intelligence documents. They moved through hedgerows and fields, avoiding roads and open areas. German patrols were everywhere. The invasion had clearly begun, and Germans were responding. Caldwell's stick heard artillery in the distance and saw aircraft overhead. Allied aircraft, which meant the invasion was underway. At 0600 hours, they encountered Canadian infantry advancing inland from Juno Beach. The infantry were from the Regina Rifle Regiment, part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Caldwell identified himself and his stick. The infantry commander, a captain, was shocked. "Sergeant, you're 12 kilometers inland. How did you get here?" Caldwell explained. "We dropped in the wrong location. We captured a German headquarters by accident. We have intelligence." The captain looked skeptical until Caldwell showed him the maps and documents. The captain's expression changed immediately. "This shows German positions across the entire sector. Command needs this immediately." The captain radioed back to beach headquarters. Within 30 minutes, an intelligence officer arrived by jeep, a major from Division Intelligence. The major examined the documents Caldwell's stick had captured and went pale. "Sergeant, do you understand what you have here? This is the German defensive plan for 20 kilometers of coastline. Troop positions, artillery positions, reserve locations, Communication networks. This is extraordinary intelligence. Caldwell said, "We captured it from a headquarters building we assaulted by mistake. We were supposed to drop near a bridge 8 kilometers from here." The Major said, "What bridge?" Caldwell described their assigned objective. The Major checked his maps and said, "That bridge was blown up by Germans 6 hours ago. Your assigned mission was already failed before you jumped, but capturing this headquarters. You've provided intelligence that will save hundreds of lives during the advance inland." Caldwell and his stick were evacuated to beach headquarters. Morrison and Henderson were sent to field hospitals. The remaining 5 men, Caldwell, Mitchell, Walsh, Fraser, and Brennan, were debriefed by intelligence officers who asked detailed questions about the headquarters. How many Germans were there? What equipment? What documents were visible? What was destroyed? Over the following days, the intelligence captured by Caldwell's stick was used to plan Allied advances. The documents showed where German strongpoints were located, which allowed Allied forces to avoid heavily defended areas and exploit weak points. The defensive plans revealed German strategy, which allowed Allied commanders to anticipate German responses. In late June 1944, Caldwell received a message that his commanding officer wanted to see him. Caldwell reported to battalion headquarters, expecting either commendation or reprimand for abandoning his assigned mission. Lieutenant Colonel Fraser Eady, commanding officer of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, looked at Caldwell and said, "Sergeant, I've reviewed your actions on D-Day. You were assigned to secure a bridge. You failed that mission completely." Caldwell said, "Yes, sir. We dropped in the wrong location and couldn't reach the bridge." Eady continued, "Instead, you assaulted a German headquarters, captured intelligence of extraordinary value, held that headquarters against superior numbers for 90 minutes, evacuated with the intelligence, and returned to Allied lines, all while losing 0 men killed and only 2 wounded." "Yes, sir." "Sergeant Caldwell, you failed your assigned mission and succeeded at a mission you weren't assigned. I'm recommending you and your entire stick for decorations. You captured intelligence that has saved Allied lives and will continue saving lives as we advance." Caldwell didn't know what to say. Eady smiled. "Sometimes the wrong objective turns out to be the right objective. Well done, Sergeant." Aftermath. Caldwell and his stick received military medals for their D-Day actions. The citation mentioned extraordinary initiative and courage in capturing valuable enemy intelligence while operating behind enemy lines. The citation didn't mention they were supposed to be somewhere else entirely. The 5 missing paratroopers from Caldwell's stick eventually rejoined the battalion. They had landed scattered across 15 kilometers, regrouped in small groups, and fought their way back to Allied lines over several days. All 5 survived. Morrison recovered from his shoulder wound and returned to duty in August 1944. Henderson's leg wound required surgery, but he recovered fully and also returned to duty. Both men continued serving through the remainder of the war. The captured German intelligence was used extensively during Allied operations in Normandy. The defensive plans showed German strategy for counterattacking Allied beachheads, which allowed Allied commanders to position forces effectively to counter those attacks. The maps showing artillery positions were used to target German guns with Allied counter-battery fire. An intelligence officer later estimated that the intelligence captured by Caldwell's stick contributed to saving approximately 200 Allied lives during the first week of the Normandy campaign, by allowing forces to avoid heavily defended positions and exploit weaknesses in German defenses. Post-war. Caldwell returned to Canada in 1945 and resumed civilian life in Winnipeg. He worked in his father's hardware store and later owned his own store. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say he served with paratroopers in Normandy and leave it at that. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a military historian contacted Caldwell asking about his D-Day experience. Caldwell was 68 years old. The historian had found battalion records describing the headquarters assault and intelligence capture. The historian asked Caldwell to explain what happened. Caldwell described the mission: dropping in the wrong location, assaulting the headquarters by accident, capturing intelligence, holding against German assaults, evacuating with the intelligence. The historian was fascinated. "You were assigned to capture a bridge, but instead captured a German headquarters?" "That's correct," Caldwell said. "And the bridge you were supposed to capture was already destroyed before you jumped?" "Yes, so we couldn't have succeeded at our assigned mission anyway." The historian asked, "Do you think dropping in the wrong location was fortunate?" Caldwell thought carefully. "I don't think it was fortunate. It was chaotic. We were scattered, lost, outnumbered. We stumbled into that headquarters accidentally. We made decisions based on circumstances we couldn't control. It worked out, but it could easily have ended differently. If those 10 Germans at the headquarters had been more alert, they would have killed us. If German reinforcements had arrived 5 minutes earlier, we would have been trapped. We succeeded through a combination of aggression, luck, and German mistakes." The historian asked, "But you held that headquarters against superior numbers for 90 minutes. That wasn't luck." "No," Caldwell agreed. "That was stubbornness. We had intelligence that needed to get back to Allied command. We held until we couldn't hold any more. Then we evacuated and completed the mission. That part was deliberate." In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Caldwell attended ceremonies in Normandy with other D-Day veterans. He met with French civilians who lived in the area where his stick had operated. One elderly Frenchman approached Caldwell and said through a translator, "I was 14 years old on D-Day. I watched from my family's farm as 7 Canadian paratroopers fought maybe 100 Germans at a headquarters building. You held that building for over an hour. We thought you were insane. Then you escaped and the Germans destroyed the building with mortars. We thought you were all dead. I'm glad to see you survived." Caldwell thanked the man. The man continued, "That headquarters coordinated German defenses in this sector. After you destroyed it and killed the officers, German forces in this area became disorganized. Allied forces advanced more quickly because German command was disrupted. You may not have known it at the time, but what you did mattered." Caldwell died in 2002 at age 86. His obituary mentioned his D-Day service and military medal, but didn't describe the specific circumstances. Most people reading the obituary would never know that Caldwell and his stick had failed their assigned mission completely, while succeeding at an unassigned mission that saved Allied lives. The lesson. The lesson from Caldwell's story is about adapting to circumstances beyond your control. Caldwell and his stick were supposed to secure a bridge. They dropped in the wrong location, couldn't find the bridge, and accidentally assaulted a German headquarters instead. Everything went wrong with their plan, but they adapted. When they realized they were lost, they didn't panic or freeze. They gathered information by capturing Germans. When they discovered the headquarters was full of intelligence, they recognized its value. When Germans counterattacked, they defended aggressively. When the situation became untenable, they evacuated with the intelligence. None of this was planned. It was improvisation based on circumstances. The original plan failed completely, but Caldwell made decisions based on what was possible rather than what was planned. He assessed each situation as it developed and chose actions that made sense given available information and resources. This is different from most military success stories where plans work as intended. Caldwell's plan failed. His success came from recognizing the plan had failed and adapting, rather than rigidly following a plan that no longer applied. The intelligence captured accidentally was more valuable than the bridge they were supposed to secure.
The bridge was already destroyed, so their assigned mission was impossible before they even jumped. But the headquarters they captured by accident provided intelligence that saved Allied lives. Through accident and adaptation, they accomplished something more important than their assigned mission. Sometimes failing the plan is necessary to succeed at the mission. The plan was to secure a bridge. The mission was to support D-Day invasion. Caldwell failed the plan, but succeeded at the mission through improvisation and adaptation. That's worth recognizing. Plans fail constantly, but missions can still succeed if people adapt to circumstances. Caldwell and his stick made this work through aggression, quick decisions, and willingness to take risks. They assaulted a headquarters they stumbled into. They held it against superior numbers. They evacuated under fire with valuable intelligence. None of this was in the plan. All of it contributed to mission success. Sometimes the wrong objective is the right objective. Sometimes getting lost leads to finding something more valuable than what you were looking for. Sometimes failing the plan is the first step to succeeding at the mission. Caldwell understood this instinctively and acted on it. That's why 7 paratroopers who dropped in the wrong place accomplished more than they would have if they had dropped in the right place. July 18th, 1944, Normandy, France, 15 kilometers south of Caen. The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius, and smoke from artillery fire drifted across farmland when Lieutenant David Morrison realized he was trapped behind German lines with no way back to Canadian forces. Morrison was 27 years old, a scout with the Regina Rifle Regiment, and he had been sent forward to gather intelligence on German Panzer positions before a planned Canadian attack. The mission was simple: observe German tank concentrations, note locations, return with intelligence. But German forces had counterattacked while Morrison was scouting, pushing Canadian lines back 3 kilometers. Morrison was now isolated in enemy territory with valuable intelligence and no clear route home. He crouched in a hedgerow, watching German soldiers move along a road 100 meters away, and calculated his options. Try to infiltrate back through German lines on foot, extremely risky. Hide and wait for Canadian forces to advance again, could take days or weeks. Or surrender, unacceptable. He had intelligence that needed to reach Canadian command. Then Morrison saw something that gave him a fourth option: a dead German soldier lying in a ditch 50 meters away, approximately Morrison's build. Morrison spoke fluent German. His grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria, and he had grown up speaking German at home. He made a decision that would either save his life or get him executed as a spy. He would take the dead German's uniform and papers and pretend to be a German soldier until he could escape back to Allied lines. David Morrison came from Regina, Saskatchewan. His grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria in the early 1900s and settled in a German-Canadian community. Morrison grew up speaking German at home and English at school. By age 10, he was fluently bilingual. When war began in 1939, Morrison enlisted in the Canadian Army. When officers discovered he spoke fluent German, they trained him as a scout and interrogator. Morrison's German was so fluent, no accent, perfect grammar, Bavarian idioms from his grandparents, that German prisoners often assumed he was German himself. Morrison deployed to Britain in 1943 and landed in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By mid-July, Canadian forces were fighting toward Caen against German panzer divisions. Canadian command needed intelligence about exact panzer positions. Morrison was assigned scout missions: go forward, observe German positions, return with intelligence. On July 18th, Morrison was sent to locate German panzer concentrations south of Caen. He moved through hedgerows before dawn, reaching a position 3 kilometers ahead of Canadian lines by 0600 hours. He observed German positions through binoculars for 2 hours. Panther tanks in tree lines, artillery emplacements camouflaged with netting, supply trucks moving ammunition. Morrison noted everything: tank types, quantities, exact locations. By 0800 hours, he had valuable intelligence and prepared to return. But at 0815 hours, German forces launched a counterattack. Morrison heard artillery firing and saw German infantry advancing toward Canadian positions. The counterattack pushed Canadian forces back. Morrison heard radio traffic, Canadian units retreating 3 kilometers north. Morrison was now behind German lines. He had two problems: isolated in enemy territory and carrying intelligence Canadian command desperately needed. Infiltrating back through German lines on foot was extremely dangerous. German forces advancing, heightened alert, patrols everywhere. Hiding and waiting could take weeks, and his intelligence would be obsolete. Surrendering was unacceptable. Morrison considered options while watching German soldiers pass. Then he saw the dead German soldier in a ditch 50 meters away. The body was fresh, killed recently during the counterattack, probably by Canadian artillery. A shell had exploded nearby, killing this soldier and 2 others whose bodies lay further along the ditch.
The soldier appeared approximately Morrison's height and build. Morrison had an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. Take the dead German's uniform and identity, pretend to be a German soldier, and walk through German territory until he found opportunity to slip back to Allied lines. Extremely risky. Germans would execute him as spy if discovered, but less risky than trying to sneak through German lines as a Canadian scout. Morrison moved to the ditch and examined the dead German. The soldier was a Gefreiter, Lance Corporal, named Klaus Weber, age 24 according to his Soldbuch, paybook. Weber had been killed by shrapnel, wounds to chest. His uniform was blood-stained but intact. Morrison stripped Weber's body, taking the uniform, helmet, equipment belt, Soldbuch, and identification tags. He hid his Canadian uniform under leaves. Then Morrison put on Weber's uniform. It fit reasonably well, slightly tight in shoulders but acceptable. Morrison checked Weber's Soldbuch carefully. Weber was assigned to 12th SS Panzer Division, 2nd Company, stationed near Caen. Morrison would need to know this if questioned. Morrison also took Weber's rifle, a Karabiner 98K. Carrying the rifle was essential to looking like a German soldier. Morrison studied his appearance. He looked like a German soldier. Uniform authentic, helmet fit, rifle natural. His German was fluent and accent-free. The only risk was encountering someone who knew Weber personally, but 12th SS Panzer Division had thousands of soldiers. Encountering someone who knew Weber was unlikely if Morrison stayed away from Weber's specific unit. Morrison made his decision. He would pose as Gefreiter Klaus Weber until he could escape back to Allied lines. He estimated this would take hours, perhaps a day. He didn't anticipate 3 days. Morrison left the ditch and walked onto the road where German soldiers were regrouping. He joined approximately 30 soldiers from various units. Morrison kept quiet, listening to conversations. A sergeant approached Morrison. "You're from 12th SS Panzer Division?" Morrison said in German, "Yes, Herr Unteroffizier, 2nd Company." "What are you doing here? Your unit is 5 kilometers east." Morrison improvised. "Separated during the counterattack, trying to rejoin my company." The sergeant accepted this. Soldiers getting separated was common. "Head east along this road. You'll find 12th SS positions near the village." Morrison thanked the sergeant and began walking east with other Germans. He was now actively participating in German military movement, wearing enemy uniform, carrying enemy weapons, speaking German with Germans who believed he was one of them. Every step deeper increased risk of discovery and execution, but turning back was impossible. He was surrounded. After 2 kilometers, Morrison reached a German assembly area where units were regrouping. Approximately 200 German soldiers near a farmhouse serving as command post. Morrison joined them, trying to remain inconspicuous. A German officer, an Oberleutnant, was organizing soldiers. All soldiers from 12th SS Panzer Division report here. Morrison hesitated. Reporting meant grouping with 12th SS, who might know Weber. Not reporting might attract attention. Morrison walked toward the officer, but stayed at back of the group. Approximately 15 soldiers gathered. The Oberleutnant said, "You men will escort supply trucks to ammunition depot 3 kilometers north. Move out immediately." The group walked to supply trucks. Morrison and 14 Germans rode in one truck, while the convoy drove north through German-held territory. Morrison sat quietly, listening. 2 soldiers near Morrison discussed the counterattack. One said, "We pushed Canadians back 3 kilometers this morning, but they'll counterattack soon." The other said, "Let them. We have Panthers and Tigers. Canadian Shermans are no match." Morrison listened carefully. Intelligence. German soldiers confident in armor superiority. He needed to remember this. After 30 minutes, the convoy arrived at an ammunition depot, a camouflaged supply point where artillery ammunition was stored in dugouts. Soldiers began unloading. Morrison helped, moving wooden crates of artillery shells from trucks to dugouts. He was now actively supporting German military operations while wearing German uniform. This created severe moral discomfort. Morrison was Canadian. His duty was fighting Germans, not helping them resupply. But refusing would expose him. He unloaded ammunition while mentally cataloging everything: depot location, ammunition quantities, storage methods, guard numbers, all intelligence Canadian forces could use. After unloading, the Oberleutnant said, "You men remain here tonight. Depot needs guards. Tomorrow, you'll return to units." Morrison's heart sank. He had hoped to slip away during convoy, but now assigned guard duty at German depot with 14 Germans. He would spend night surrounded by enemies with no escape opportunity. Soldiers were assigned guard shifts. Morrison was assigned 0200 to 0400 hours, middle of night. Until then, free time. Soldiers gathered near a dugout serving as sleeping quarters. They ate rations, talked, smoked. Morrison participated minimally, speaking only when spoken to. One soldier asked Morrison, "Where are you from?" Morrison said, "Bavaria, near Munich." "I'm from Bavaria too. Which town?" Morrison's grandparents had been from near Munich. Morrison said, "Small village. You wouldn't know it. Try me. I know Bavaria well." Morrison improvised, "Pentsburg." The soldier nodded. "I know Pentsburg. Coal mining town. Hard place." Morrison agreed, and the soldier moved to another topic. Morrison breathed carefully. He needed to be more careful. As evening came, Morrison lay in the dugout with Germans, listening to them talk about families, home, war. Several expressed war weariness, tired of fighting, wanting home, doubting Germany could win. Valuable intelligence about morale. Morrison memorized conversations. At midnight, Morrison tried to sleep but couldn't. He was in a German dugout, surrounded by Germans who would execute him if they discovered he was Canadian. Stress was enormous. Every sound made him alert. Every time someone approached, he worried. Have they discovered who I am? At 0200 hours, Morrison was woken for guard duty. He took position at depot perimeter with another guard, a soldier named Friedrich from Hamburg, who talked constantly. Friedrich complained about war, officers, food quality. Morrison listened and made minimal responses. During the 2-hour shift, Morrison watched for escape opportunities. Depot was in farmland, with hedgerows extending in all directions. Canadian lines approximately 5 kilometers north. If Morrison could slip away during darkness, he might reach Canadian positions by dawn. But escape, impossible. Friedrich with him constantly. Guards positioned every 50 meters around perimeter. Running would be noticed immediately. Morrison would be shot before covering 100 meters. At 0400 hours, Morrison's shift ended. He returned to dugout and tried to sleep. Managed perhaps 1 hour before soldiers awakened at 0600. The Oberleutnant arrived.
Ammunition trucks returning to supply depot. You men will escort them. After that, return to units. Morrison felt relief. Trucks returning, hopefully closer to front lines, where he might slip away. The convoy drove south 40 minutes, arriving at larger supply depot near a town. Approximately 500 German soldiers, supply personnel, infantry resting, repair crews. Morrison helped unload, then the Oberleutnant dismissed them. Return to your units. Other soldiers left in various directions. Morrison walked away confidently, as if he knew where he was going, planning to find hiding place and wait for darkness.
But a sergeant called, "You, Gefreiter Weber." Morrison's blood went cold. Someone had called Weber's name. Morrison turned. A sergeant approaching, man in 30s with scarred face. "Weber, where's your unit?" Morrison said, "2nd Company, 12th SS Panzer Division, Herr Feldwebel." "I know that. Where are they positioned?" Morrison said honestly, "I don't know, Herr Feldwebel. Separated during counterattack yesterday, trying to rejoin." The sergeant studied Morrison suspiciously. "You've been separated a full day and haven't found your unit." "Situation has been chaotic, Herr Feldwebel." Suspicion deepened. Morrison prepared to run. Then the sergeant said, "Come with me. I'll take you to 12th SS positions." Morrison had no choice. He followed the sergeant to a motorcycle with sidecar. Sergeant started engine. Morrison climbed in. They drove east, passing German positions, artillery, Panther tanks camouflaged in tree lines. Morrison memorized everything, more intelligence. After 20 minutes, they reached farmhouse serving as 12th SS Panzer Division headquarters. Sergeant stopped. "Wait here. I'll find where 2nd Company is." Sergeant went inside. Morrison sat calculating. He could run now, but Germans everywhere. Running would attract attention. He would be shot. Sergeant emerged with Lieutenant. Lieutenant approached Morrison. "You're Gefreiter Weber?" "Yes, Herr Oberleutnant." "I'm from 3rd Company. I don't know you, but 2nd Company is positioned 2 kilometers north. Sergeant will take you." Morrison realized with horror, being taken to Weber's actual unit, where soldiers would know Weber personally. Morrison would be exposed immediately. He needed to escape before reaching 2nd Company. Sergeant returned to motorcycle. Morrison climbed in sidecar. They drove north. Morrison's mind raced. In 10 minutes, they'd reach 2nd Company. Someone there would recognize immediately Morrison wasn't Weber. He would be identified as imposter, interrogated, executed. Morrison needed to act now. As a motorcycle rounded curve, Morrison said loudly, "Herr Feldwebel, stop! I need to piss." Sergeant slowed and stopped. Morrison climbed out and walked toward bushes at roadside. Sergeant remained with motorcycle, smoking. Morrison walked behind bushes. He had perhaps 30 seconds before Sergeant became suspicious. Morrison looked around. Bushes provided cover 20 meters before opening onto field. Beyond field was tree line, maybe 300 meters away. If Morrison round for tree line, Sergeant would see, shout, possibly shoot. But Morrison had no option. In 10 minutes, he'd be at 2nd Company, where he'd certainly be exposed and executed. Running gave him chance. Small, but real. Morrison ran. He burst from bushes and sprinted across field toward tree line. Behind him, Sergeant shouted in German, "Halt! Stop!" Morrison kept running. Heard Sergeant shouting again, then gunshot. Bullet snapped past Morrison's head. Morrison zigzagged, making himself hard a target. Sergeant fired again. Bullet hit Morrison's left shoulder, grazing wound that tore fabric and skin. Morrison stumbled, but kept running. Pain burned through his shoulder. Blood soaked his uniform sleeve. Sergeant fired third shot. Bullet hit dirt beside Morrison. Morrison reached tree line and plunged into forest.
More gunfire behind, but bullets hit trees. Morrison ran through forest, crashing through underbrush, no longer trying to be quiet, just trying to get distance. He ran 10 minutes before stopping to listen. No pursuit sounds. Either Sergeant had given up or was following quietly. Morrison moved carefully through forest, heading north by compass toward estimated Canadian positions. His shoulder burned. Blood dripped from fingers. He had perhaps 3 hours to navigate back to Canadian lines while bleeding from gunshot wound. For next 3 hours, Morrison navigated through Norman forest and farmland. He tore fabric from his undershirt and wrapped his shoulder to slow bleeding.
The wound wasn't deep. Bullet had grazed skin and muscle, but hadn't hit bone. Painful, but not life-threatening, if he could stop bleeding. Morrison moved north, avoiding German positions when spotted, hiding when German patrols passed. He was exhausted, in pain, and still wearing German uniform, which made him target for both sides. Germans would shoot him as deserter, Canadians would shoot him as German. At approximately 1400 hours, Morrison reached frontline area. He could hear artillery, machine guns, combat sounds. He crouched in hedgerow and observed. Through gaps in smoke, he saw Canadian positions approximately 400 meters ahead. German positions behind him approximately 300 meters. He was in no man's land. Morrison needed to reach Canadian lines without being shot by Canadians who would see only German uniform. He removed his German helmet and raised it on stick above hedgerow, waving it. Risky signal. Germans might see and shoot, but Canadians needed to see he was trying to signal. After 2 minutes waving, Morrison saw movement in Canadian positions. A Canadian soldier looking through binoculars. Morrison shouted in English as loudly as possible. "Canadian soldier! Scout from Regina Rifles! Don't shoot! I'm wearing German uniform, but I'm Canadian!" No response. Morrison shouted again. "Lieutenant David Morrison, Regina Rifles. Intelligence officer sent me forward 3 days ago. I'm coming toward your position. Don't shoot." Silence. Morrison had to risk it. He stood from hedgerow, hands raised, German helmet on stick held high, and began walking slowly toward Canadian positions. He was fully visible. A German soldier with blood-soaked uniform, walking toward Canadian lines with hands raised. Machine gun fire erupted from Canadian positions. Bullets tore through air around Morrison. He dove to ground and shouted, "Don't shoot, I'm Canadian. Lieutenant Morrison, Regina Rifles." Machine gun fire stopped. Morrison heard shouting from Canadian positions. He stayed on ground, hands visible, and shouted again. "Lieutenant David Morrison, sent forward July 18th to scout Panzer positions, wearing German uniform as disguise. Don't shoot. I'm wounded and bleeding." Voice from Canadian positions shouted in English, "Stay where you are. Don't move." Morrison stayed motionless. After several minutes, he saw 3 Canadian soldiers approaching cautiously with rifles aimed. They surrounded Morrison, weapons ready. One soldier said, "Who are you?" Morrison said, "Lieutenant David Morrison, Regina Rifle Regiment, Intelligence Section. Sent forward July 18th to scout German Panzer positions. German counterattack cut me off. I took dead German's uniform and posed as German soldier 3 days to escape back to lines." Canadian soldier said skeptically, "Prove you're Canadian." Morrison provided details, commanding officer's name, unit designation, exact mission given 3 days ago, personal information only Regina Rifles officer would know. Soldiers remained suspicious. Morrison could be German spy who interrogated Canadian prisoners and learned details. Second soldier said, "You're wounded. Shoulders bleeding. German sergeant shot me when I escaped. Grazing wound. Could be wounded German soldier trying to surrender." Third soldier said, "We take him to HQ. Let officers decide. Could be spy." Morrison was escorted back to Canadian positions with rifles aimed at him entire time. Soldiers treated him as potential enemy until proven otherwise. At forward Canadian position, Morrison was questioned by a lieutenant who didn't recognize him. Morrison repeated his story. Lieutenant remained skeptical.
You expect me to believe you spent 3 days posing as German soldier? Yes, sir. I had intelligence about German Panzer positions. Getting that intelligence back to command was critical.
Posing as German was only viable way. Or you're German spy with good English.
Morrison spent next hour being interrogated by increasingly senior officers, each skeptical. Finally, an intelligence officer who had briefed Morrison on July 18th arrived and recognized him.
That's Lieutenant Morrison. I briefed him 3 days ago on his scouting mission. He's genuine.
Morrison was finally accepted as Canadian. Medical personnel treated his shoulder wound, cleaned, bandaged, not serious. Then, Morrison was brought to Regina Rifles headquarters for debriefing. Morrison provided full report. German Panzer positions observed July 18th, ammunition depot locations, troop movements, morale observations from conversations with German soldiers, everything memorized over 3 days. Intelligence was extremely valuable. Morrison had observed German positions and activities for 3 days while living among Germans. Information no other scout could have obtained. Morrison's commanding officer, Major Robert Clark, said after debriefing, "Lieutenant, you took extraordinary risk. Impersonating enemy soldiers is extremely dangerous. If caught, Germans would have executed you as spy." Morrison said, "Yes, sir, but I had intelligence that needed to reach you. No other way to get back through German lines." "Intelligence you provided is exceptionally valuable, but what you did, wearing enemy uniform, posing as enemy, is not standard procedure. Extremely risky." "I understand, sir." Major Clark paused. "Nevertheless, you showed remarkable resourcefulness and courage. Intelligence you gathered is being sent to division headquarters immediately. I'm recommending you for decoration." Morrison was awarded Military Cross in September 1944 for exceptional courage and resourcefulness in gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Morrison continued serving as scout through remainder of Normandy campaign and into advance across France, Belgium, Germany. He never again impersonated German soldier. 3 days as Weber had been enough. But he continued scouting missions, gathering intelligence that helped Canadian forces plan operations. Morrison survived the war and returned to Canada in 1945. He resumed civilian life in Regina. He rarely spoke about war experiences. The 3 days posing as German remained private memory, something extraordinary done under desperate circumstances, but not particularly wanting public discussion. Post-war perspective. In 1967, military historian researching Canadian intelligence operations contacted Morrison about July 1944 mission. Morrison was 50 and hadn't discussed incident in detail for 20 years. Morrison described 3 days as Weber, taking uniform, joining Germans, escorting ammunition, overnight at depot, sergeant taking him toward unit, desperate escape, terrifying return to Canadian lines. Historian asked, "How did you feel during those 3 days pretending to be German?" Morrison thought carefully. "Terrified constantly. Every moment worried someone would recognize I wasn't Weber. Every conversation created risk. Every order forced difficult choices. When helping unload German ammunition, I was actively supporting enemy operations. That felt deeply wrong, but refusing would expose me immediately. Did you consider surrendering rather than impersonating German? Yes, but I had intelligence Canadian command needed urgently. Thousands of Canadian soldiers about to attack German positions. Intelligence I had could save their lives by showing where German strength was concentrated and where gaps existed. I couldn't surrender, knowing that information wouldn't reach command." Historian asked, "Looking back, do you think what you did was justified?" Morrison, quiet for a moment. "Justified is a complicated word. What I did was necessary given circumstances. I was trapped with valuable intelligence. Impersonating German was only viable way to escape and deliver intelligence." It worked. Intelligence helped Canadian operations. In that sense, yes, justified. but it created moral complications. I wore enemy uniform. I participated in enemy activities. I helped load ammunition that would be used against Canadians. These things troubled me then, and still trouble me now. War creates situations where clean moral choices don't exist. You do what seems necessary to accomplish mission, and hope outcome justifies methods. Morrison died in 1998 at age 81. The lesson. The lesson from Morrison's story is about extreme adaptation under desperate circumstances and moral complexity of deception in warfare. Morrison was trapped behind enemy lines with valuable intelligence. Conventional options, infiltrating through lines, hiding and waiting, were not viable. Morrison chose unconventional and extremely risky option: impersonate enemy soldier and live among enemy until escape opportunity emerged. This required multiple forms of deception: wearing enemy uniform, violation of military law if caught, actively participating in enemy activities, unloading ammunition, and maintaining false identity under constant scrutiny. Each created moral complications. Morrison helped the enemy while pretending to be one of them, but deception served purpose, delivering intelligence that would help Canadian forces and potentially save Canadian lives. Moral compromise was justified by outcome. Intelligence Morrison gathered over 3 days was exceptionally valuable and contributed to successful operations. What makes Morrison's story distinct is sustained nature of deception, not brief disguise or quick infiltration. Morrison lived as German soldier 3 days, eating with Germans, sleeping in German dugouts, participating in German operations. This required not just language skills, but psychological discipline. Morrison had to think like German soldier, respond naturally to German orders, maintain composure under extraordinary stress. War creates situations where moral clarity is impossible. Morrison helped load ammunition used against Canadians, morally troubling. But refusing would expose him and prevent intelligence delivery that would save Canadian lives. No clean choice, only choices with different costs. Morrison understood complexity and carried it decades. 3 days as Weber troubled him not because wrong, but because morally complicated in ways simple combat was not. Combat had clear sides and purposes. Deception had ambiguity and compromise. Sometimes accomplishing missions requires methods creating moral discomfort. Sometimes saving lives requires helping enemy temporarily. Sometimes right choice is one that works rather than one that feels morally clean. Morrison understood and proceeded anyway. He survived. Intelligence reached command. Canadian operations benefited. Outcome justified methods. That's sufficient answer to moral questions, even if doesn't eliminate them entirely.
April 30th, 1943. London, England.
The temperature was 12 degrees Celsius, and rain was falling steadily when Major John Patterson sat in a briefing room at Admiralty headquarters and learned about the dead man who was going to help win the war. Patterson was 33 years old, a Canadian Army intelligence officer assigned to liaison duty with British intelligence, and he had spent 2 years analyzing German defensive capabilities without encountering anything as bizarre as what he was hearing now. A British naval intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague stood at the front of the room, describing an operation that sounded more like crime fiction than military planning. They were going to take a corpse, dress it as a Royal Marines officer, attach a briefcase containing false invasion plans to its wrist, and dump it off the coast of Spain, where German intelligence would find it and believe the false plans were real. John Patterson came from Toronto, Ontario. His father was a lawyer with a downtown firm. Patterson grew up in comfortable middle-class circumstances, attended the University of Toronto, and studied history with focus on military campaigns. He joined the Canadian Army in 1939 when war began and was commissioned as an intelligence officer because he spoke German and French fluently and had academic background in military history. By April 1943, he had been working in intelligence for 4 years, mostly analyzing German order of battle and defensive preparations. He was good at his work, but found it tedious. Counting German divisions and tracking unit movements was important, but not particularly interesting. The briefing he was attending promised to be different. Montague explained Operation Mincemeat's logic. The Allies were planning to invade Sicily in July 1943. This invasion was predictable because Sicily was the obvious next step after North Africa. The Germans knew this. They were reinforcing Sicily. The Allies needed the Germans to divert forces away from Sicily to defend somewhere else. The solution was to convince the Germans the actual invasion target was Greece, not Sicily. If the Germans believed Greece was the target, they would move divisions from Sicily to Greece. Then, when the Allies invaded Sicily, German defenses would be weaker than expected. But how do you convince enemy intelligence that your invasion target is somewhere other than the obvious location? Montague explained that German intelligence trusted documents more than agent reports. If the Germans captured actual Allied planning documents describing an invasion of Greece, they would believe those documents. The challenge was getting authentic-looking documents into German hands without making it obvious the documents were planted. That's where the corpse came in. The plan was to obtain a body, dress it as a Royal Marines courier, and attach a briefcase containing letters from senior Allied officers discussing invasion plans for Greece. The body would be released from a submarine off the coast of Spain. Spain was neutral but sympathetic to Germany. Spanish authorities would find the body and notify the Germans. German intelligence would photograph the documents, analyze them, and conclude they had discovered actual Allied invasion plans. The Germans would reinforce Greece. The Allies would invade Sicily against weaker defenses. Patterson listened to this explanation with growing disbelief. He understood the strategic logic. Deception was valuable. Diverting German forces from the real invasion site would save Allied lives. But the method seemed absurdly complex and dependent on too many assumptions. What if the Spanish didn't find the body? What if they found it but didn't notify the Germans? What if the Germans analyzed the documents and concluded they were fake? What if the body decomposed too much to be credible? Montague seemed to have considered all these objections and had answers for each. The body would be released close enough to shore that currents would carry it to land within 24 hours. Spanish fishermen operated in that area constantly. Discovery was nearly certain. Spanish authorities had a pattern of cooperating with German intelligence. They would notify the Germans. The documents would be created by actual Allied staff officers using authentic letterhead, authentic signature styles, and authentic concerns. German document analysis would find nothing suspicious, because nothing was suspicious except the content being false. The body would be preserved using dry ice during transport to prevent decomposition. Every detail had been planned. Patterson asked why he was being briefed on this operation. Montague explained that Patterson's role was to serve as Canadian liaison monitoring the operation and providing analysis of how German intelligence might respond. Patterson had expertise in German intelligence methods from his work analyzing their order of battle assessments. Montague wanted Patterson's assessment of whether German intelligence would believe documents found on a corpse washed up in Spain. Patterson thought carefully. German intelligence was professional and skeptical, but they also trusted documentary evidence and had a pattern of believing information that confirmed their existing suspicions. If the documents suggested Greece as invasion target, the Germans might believe it because Greece was a plausible target. Sicily was obvious. Greece was less obvious, but still strategic. The Germans might prefer to believe the less obvious target was real. Patterson told Montague he thought German intelligence would probably believe the documents if they appeared authentic and if the cover story was credible.
Montague asked what would make the cover story credible. Patterson said the body needed to have a plausible reason for carrying invasion planning documents. The documents needed to appear accidental discovery rather than deliberate plant. The timing needed to align with actual Allied planning cycles. If all these factors aligned, German intelligence would probably accept the documents as genuine. Montague seemed satisfied with this assessment and invited Patterson to observe the operation's preparation in detail. Over the next 2 weeks, Patterson became intimately familiar with the most elaborate identity fabrication he had ever encountered. The operation required transforming an anonymous corpse into a believable Royal Marines officer with a complete life history. Every detail of Major William Martin's existence had to be created from nothing and had to withstand German counterintelligence scrutiny. Patterson's first involvement was attending a meeting on March 22, 1943, at a London coroner's office. Montague had arranged to meet with Bentley Purchase, the coroner for the St. Pancras district. Purchase was 58 years old and had been coroner for 20 years. He understood that some bodies went unclaimed because the deceased had no family or the family couldn't afford burial. He also understood, though it was never stated explicitly, that the British government occasionally needed unclaimed bodies for purposes that were classified. Purchase didn't ask questions. He just verified that the body would be treated respectfully, even if its use was unconventional. Montague explained to Purchase that they needed a body of a man approximately 30 to 40 years old, who had died from causes that wouldn't be obvious upon external examination. The body would be presented as someone who died in an aircraft crash over water.
External injuries consistent with drowning were acceptable. Internal injuries that clearly indicated other causes of death were not. Purchase said he would check his records and contact Montague if suitable bodies became available. Patterson asked Montague after the meeting why aircraft crash was the cover story. Montague explained that aircraft carrying classified documents between London and Allied headquarters in North Africa occasionally crashed. This was known to German intelligence. A courier dying in such a crash and washing up on the Spanish coast was implausible, but not impossible. The implausibility actually helped the deception. If the Germans thought the British would never deliberately stage something so implausible, they might conclude it was genuine. On March 26th, Purchase contacted Montague. A suitable body was available. Glyndor Michael, age 34, homeless vagrant, died on January 28th from ingesting rat poison containing phosphorus. The phosphorus had caused liver failure but left no external marks. The body had been kept in cold storage pending identification or burial arrangements. No family had claimed it. Purchase could release the body for government use if handled through proper channels. Patterson attended the formal identification on March 28th. He, Montague, and a Royal Air Force pathologist examined Michael's body at the mortuary. The pathologist confirmed the body showed no obvious external signs of phosphorus poisoning. There was some decomposition, but preservation in cold storage had kept it minimal. With proper treatment, the body could appear to have been in cold seawater for 24 to 48 hours, consistent with drowning after aircraft crash. Patterson looked at Glyndor Michael's face and felt uncomfortable. This was a real person who had lived a difficult life and died accidentally. Now his body would be used as a prop in military deception. Patterson understood the strategic necessity, but the human reality bothered him. The body was transferred to a facility where it could be prepared for deployment. The preparation involved dressing the body in Royal Marines uniform with proper rank insignia for a major, adding personal effects that would create a believable identity, and preserving the body so it would remain intact until discovery. Patterson observed each step of this preparation and analyzed it from German counterintelligence perspective. The uniform was authentic, obtained from Royal Marines stores. The rank badges were properly sewn. The boots were worn, not new, suggesting the officer had worn them before. Patterson examined the uniform and found no anomalies. A German examiner would find standard British military issue in correct configuration for a Royal Marines major. This checked out. The personal effects were more complex. Montague's team had created an entire fictional life for Major William Martin. Patterson reviewed each element. Identity documents. Major William Martin's military ID card dated 1942 with photograph. The photograph was actually of a Royal Marines officer who resembled the corpse and had agreed to pose for the fake ID. The card showed appropriate stamps and wear consistent with a year of use. Patterson examined the ID under magnification. The printing matched British military ID card standards. The photograph showed proper uniform and insignia. A German examiner checking this against British ID samples would find it authentic. Personal letters. 2 love letters, supposedly from Martin's fiancée, a woman named Pam. The letters were written by a young British intelligence officer's secretary who had agreed to create a fictional persona. The letters discussed wedding plans, mentioned Martin's parents, fictional, complained about rationing, and expressed concern about Martin's safety. The handwriting was feminine and consistent across both letters. The paper was cheap wartime stationery, available in any British shop. Patterson read the letters carefully. They sounded authentic. Real couples in wartime wrote exactly this kind of letter. Mundane concerns mixed with affection and worry. A German analyst reading these would conclude Martin had a fiancée and was planning marriage. This added human dimension to the identity. Photograph of fiancée. A small photograph of Pam in Martin's wallet. The photograph was actually of an intelligence office clerk who had posed in civilian clothes. She was attractive, but not remarkably so. An ordinary girlfriend's photograph. Patterson examined it and noted it looked like thousands of other girlfriend photographs British soldiers carried. Nothing suspicious. Receipts and personal items. Ticket stubs from a London theatre dated March 1943, showing Martin attended a play. A receipt for an engagement ring purchased from a London jeweller dated March 19, 1943. A receipt from a gentleman's club for dinner and drinks. All of these were genuine receipts obtained by Montague's team from the actual establishments. Patterson verified each against his knowledge of British commercial documents. A German analyst could check the theatre performance schedule and confirm that play was showing on that date. Could verify the jeweller existed at that address. Could confirm the club was a real establishment. Every detail was checkable and correct. Cigarettes and matches. A pack of Players' cigarettes, half empty, in Martin's pocket. A book of matches from a London pub. These were trivial details, but important. Real people carried half-used cigarettes and random matches. Fabricated identities often missed these mundane touches. Patterson noted that Montague's team had understood this. The cigarettes and matches made Martin's seem real because they were unremarkable. Patterson spent 3 days analysing every aspect of Major Martin's created identity and found it nearly perfect. His only concern was the engagement ring receipt. It was dated March 19, 1943, just 11 days before the operation launch date. This was cutting it close. If Germans checked when the ring was purchased and compared it to when Martin's body was found, they might notice the short time interval and question why a man who just bought an engagement ring was flying to North Africa. Patterson raised this concern with Montague. Montague acknowledged the timeline was tight, but said it actually helped the cover story. Martin was flying to North Africa precisely because he had just gotten engaged and wanted to complete his assignment quickly so he could return to Britain and get married. The haste explained why he was carrying documents personally rather than waiting for secure courier. The engagement ring receipt actually strengthened the cover story by providing motive for Martin's urgency. Patterson accepted this logic, but remained slightly uncomfortable with the timeline. The final element of preparation was the briefcase and documents. Patterson attended the drafting session for the letters that would be attached to Martin's body. 2 letters were created. Letter 1. From Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, commander of Allied forces in North Africa. The letter discussed operational planning and mentioned that Admiral Andrew Cunningham would command the Greece invasion force. It mentioned almost casually that Sicily would be used as a cover operation to deceive the Germans into thinking Sicily was the real target, when actually Greece was the real target. The letter was written in Nye's casual correspondence style, including a joke about sardines in a Sardinia context and personal remarks about mutual colleagues. The tone was exactly what a senior British officer would use writing to another senior officer about classified matters. Letter 2. From Admiral Louis Mountbatten to Admiral Andrew Cunningham. This letter introduced Major Martin as a courier and mentioned that Martin was an expert on amphibious operations who could provide Cunningham with valuable insights. The letter's real purpose was to explain why Martin was carrying the Nye Alexander letter. Martin was supposedly hand-delivering correspondence from London to Allied headquarters. This cover story explained the document's presence. Patterson read both letters multiple times. He analyzed them from German intelligence perspective. Would a German analyst believe these were authentic? Patterson thought yes, for several reasons. The letters contained specific named operations: Operation Husky, Sicily, and Operation Brimstone, Greece. These operation names sounded authentic because they matched British naming conventions. The letters referenced real officers in appropriate positions. The tone was casual and professional, matching how senior British officers actually corresponded. The letters included mundane details like Nye's joke about sardines. Real correspondence included such details. Fabricated correspondence usually didn't. Patterson's only concern was that the letters stated the deception too explicitly. They specifically said Sicily was a cover for Greece. This seemed almost too obvious. Patterson mentioned this to Montague. Montague explained that German intelligence expected British communications to discuss deception planning. The British were known for using deception. If the letters mentioned deception but identified the wrong target as real, Germans might assume the British were being honest about their deception planning while actually being deceived about what the real target was. The meta-deception was that the letters acknowledged using Sicily as cover, which made Germans think Greece was real, when actually Sicily was real and Greece was the cover. The complexity of this layered deception made Patterson's head hurt, but he acknowledged it was clever. On April 17th, all elements of Major Martin's identity were finalized. Patterson reviewed the complete package: body preserved and dressed in uniform, identity documents in pockets, love letters in wallet, engagement ring receipt showing recent purchase, theatre tickets, cigarettes, matches, briefcase chained to wrist containing the 2 letters with false invasion plans. Every detail was authentic, except the content being false. Patterson wrote his final assessment for Montague. German intelligence will analyze every element of this package. They will find authentic documents, authentic personal effects, and authentic physical evidence. Unless they imagine that British intelligence would create an entirely fictional identity using a corpse as delivery mechanism, they will conclude the documents are genuine. I assess 75% probability that Germans will believe the deception. Montague thanked Patterson for the assessment and noted it was consistent with his own expectations. The operation would proceed. On April 19th, the body of Blinder Michael, now dressed as Major William Martin with a complete fictional identity, was packed in dry ice inside a sealed canister and transported to Scotland, where it would be loaded onto HMS Seraph for deployment off the Spanish coast. Patterson watched the canister being loaded onto a military truck for transport north. Inside that canister was a dead vagrant from Wales, transformed into a Royal Marines major who never existed. The transformation had required hundreds of hours of work, creating identity documents, writing love letters, purchasing theatre tickets, and analyzing German counterintelligence methods. All of this effort to make a corpse tell a believable lie. Patterson understood the strategic necessity. He also understood the operation's success depended on Germans never imagining that anyone would go to this much effort to create a fake identity for a dead body. The audacity of the deception was both its greatest strength and its most disturbing aspect. On April 30th, 1943, HMS Seraph, a British submarine, left Holy Loch in Scotland, carrying the body of Glyndŵr Michael, dressed as Major William Martin. Patterson was not aboard the submarine. His role was to monitor the operation from London and analyze German response once the documents were discovered. The submarine reached the Spanish coast near Huelva on April 30th. At 0430 hours on that morning, the crew placed Major Martin's body into the water, approximately 1 mile offshore. The body was weighted to float rather than sink. Currents carried it toward shore. At 0930 hours, a Spanish fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria found the body floating near the beach and notified local authorities. Spanish authorities recovered the body and the attached briefcase. They notified the British Vice Consul in Huelva, as required by international protocol for bodies of foreign nationals. They also notified German intelligence, as Patterson had predicted. The German intelligence officer in Huelva, Adolf Klaus, immediately recognized the potential importance of documents attached to a British military courier. He photographed the documents before returning them to British authorities. The photographs were transmitted to Berlin for analysis. German intelligence analysts examined the documents carefully. They noted the authentic letterhead, authentic signatures, and authentic tone. They concluded the documents were genuine Allied planning materials. The documents indicated Greece and Sardinia as invasion targets, with Sicily as a feint. Patterson monitored this analysis through British signals intelligence intercepts. The British had broken German Enigma codes and could read German military communications. German messages about the documents indicated they believed the invasion would target Greece. German forces began redeploying from Sicily to Greece in early May 1943. By mid-May, 2 German divisions had moved from Sicily to Greece. Additional forces were being prepared for deployment. The deception was working exactly as planned. Patterson filed intelligence reports tracking German redeployment. His reports noted that German defensive preparations in Sicily were being reduced, while preparations in Greece intensified. This suggested the Germans believed the false documents. Patterson calculated that if the Sicily invasion occurred with current German defensive strength, Allied casualties would be approximately 25 to 30% lower than if Germans had maintained full defensive strength in Sicily. This wasn't just successful deception. This was deception that would save thousands of Allied lives. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. German defenses were substantial, but not as strong as they would have been without the deception. 2 divisions that would have defended Sicily were in Greece, defending against an invasion that never came. The Sicily invasion succeeded with casualties lower than initial estimates. Patterson's calculation of 25 to 30% casualty reduction proved roughly accurate. Post-invasion analysis estimated approximately 3,000 to 4,000 Allied lives were saved by the weakened German defenses resulting from Operation Mincemeat's success. Patterson continued his intelligence work through 1944 and 1945. He never mentioned Operation Mincemeat in his regular reports. The operation remained classified at the highest level. After the war ended in May 1945, Patterson returned to Canada. He was demobilized in September 1945 and returned to Toronto. He got a job teaching history at the University of Toronto. He taught military history courses and occasionally mentioned that he had worked in intelligence during the war, but provided no details. Operation Mincemeat remained classified. Patterson honored the classification and said nothing. In 1953, a book titled The Man Who Never Was published in Britain. The author was Ewan Montague, who described Operation Mincemeat in detail. The book revealed the operation publicly for the first time. Montague described planning the operation, creating Major Martin's identity, deploying the body, and analyzing German response. The book became a bestseller. It was adapted into a film in 1956. Operation Mincemeat became one of the most famous deception operations of World War II. Patterson read the book and watched the film. Neither mentioned Canadian involvement because no official Canadian involvement existed. Patterson's liaison role had been informal and undocumented. In 1957, Patterson received a letter from Montague asking if they could correspond about the operation from Patterson's perspective. Montague was writing a more detailed account and wanted to include analysis of German intelligence response. Patterson agreed to correspond. They exchanged letters for 2 years. Patterson described his analysis of why German intelligence believed the documents. He explained that Germans trusted documentary evidence more than agent reports. They had a pattern of believing information that aligned with plausible strategic alternatives. Greece was plausible. Therefore, documents suggesting Greece were believable. Montague asked if Patterson thought the operation's success was inevitable or fortunate. Patterson said neither. It was well planned and well executed, but it also required German intelligence to make specific analytical decisions that could have gone differently. If they had been more skeptical about documents found on a body, if they had questioned why a courier carried invasion planning documents rather than using secure communication channels, if they had investigated Major Martin's background more thoroughly and discovered he didn't exist, any of these alternative decisions would have revealed the deception. The operation succeeded because the Germans made decisions that seemed reasonable, but were wrong. Montague asked if Patterson felt the operation was morally acceptable, given it used a dead person's body without family consent. Patterson had thought about this question for years. Glyndor Michael was dead from an accidental poisoning. His death was tragic. We used his body to save thousands of living soldiers. I don't know if he would have consented if asked, but I think most people would consent to their body being used to save thousands of lives if they were asked posthumously. This doesn't make it clearly right, but it makes it less clearly wrong. They discussed the ethical complexity of the operation for several letters. Montague admitted he had occasional discomfort about using Michael's body. Patterson admitted similar discomfort. Neither could resolve the ethical question definitively. They agreed that wartime necessity justified actions that peacetime ethics might not justify. This didn't eliminate the ethical complexity. It just acknowledged that war creates situations where all available choices have ethical problems, and you choose the least problematic option. In 1968, a German military historian named Dr. Wilhelm Schmidt published a book analyzing German intelligence failures during World War II. The book included a chapter about Operation Mincemeat. Schmidt had access to German intelligence files and described how German analysts examined the documents found on Major Martin, concluded they were genuine, and recommended redeploying forces to Greece. Schmidt wrote that German intelligence had made a fundamental analytical error. They assumed documents found by chance were necessarily authentic. They hadn't seriously considered that the documents might be deliberately planted. The possibility was mentioned in one internal memo, but dismissed as unlikely because the British would not use a corpse for deception purposes. Patterson read Schmidt's book and wrote to him asking if they could correspond. Schmidt agreed. They exchanged letters for 5 years. Schmidt asked Patterson to explain from Allied intelligence perspective how the deception was designed to exploit German analytical patterns. Patterson explained that British intelligence understood Germans trusted documents more than agent reports. They designed the deception to provide documentary evidence in a format Germans would trust. The body was the delivery mechanism. The documents were the weapon. The Germans' own analytical preferences made them vulnerable to this specific deception method. Schmidt asked if Patterson thought German analysts were incompetent for believing the documents. Patterson said no. They were competent analysts making reasonable judgments based on available information. The documents appeared authentic because they were authentic, except for the content being false. The discovery circumstances appeared accidental because they were designed to appear accidental. German analysts did everything correctly, Except imagine that British intelligence would use a corpse to deliver false documents. This wasn't analytical failure. This was failure of imagination about what the enemy might do. Schmidt asked what lessons German intelligence should have learned from this failure. Patterson said, "Distrust all information that seems too valuable. If you discover the enemy's invasion plans by accident, you probably didn't discover them by accident. Either the enemy wanted you to discover them, or the information is less valuable than it appears." German intelligence trusted the Mincemeat documents because they seemed valuable. They should have distrusted them for exactly that reason. In 1975, Schmidt traveled to Toronto to meet Patterson. Schmidt was 62 years old. Patterson was 65. They met at Patterson's house and spent an afternoon discussing the operation from opposing perspectives. Schmidt brought copies of German intelligence analysis from 1943, showing how they assessed the Mincemeat documents. Patterson looked at the analysis and saw how thoroughly the Germans had examined the documents. They had verified the letterhead, analyzed the handwriting, checked the signatures against known examples, and examined the paper and ink. Every technical test confirmed authenticity. The Germans had done excellent forensic analysis. They just didn't imagine the British would create technically perfect false documents attached to a corpse. Patterson asked if knowing about British willingness to use corpses for deception would have changed German analytical approach. Schmidt said yes. If we had imagined this possibility, we would have questioned why a courier carried such important documents physically rather than using encrypted communications. We would have investigated Major Martin's background more thoroughly. We would have asked why the plane supposedly crashed but left the body intact enough to recover. All these questions have answers that reveal the deception. But we never asked the questions because we didn't imagine corpse-based deception was possible. They discussed whether Schmidt felt angry about being deceived. Schmidt said no. We were at war. Both sides used deception. The British used it more effectively than we defended against it. That's just fact. Being angry about losing to a better deception is pointless. I would prefer to understand how the deception worked so future intelligence analysts don't make the same mistakes. Patterson appreciated this perspective. You're treating the deception as a professional problem rather than a personal offense. That's the right approach. We were both professionals doing our jobs. Your job was preventing Allied invasion. My job was helping Allied invasion succeed. We used deception. You failed to detect it. These are just facts. Schmidt asked Patterson if he felt proud of Operation Mincemeat's success. Patterson thought carefully. Pride is complicated. I feel satisfied that the deception worked and saved Allied lives. I feel uncomfortable about using a dead man's body without his consent. I feel uncertain about whether the operation's success was primarily good planning or fortunate German decisions. All these feelings coexist. Pride seems too simple for what actually happened. Schmidt said he understood this complexity. War creates situations where you do things that achieve good results through questionable methods. The results justify the methods strategically, but not necessarily ethically. You live with both the results and the methods. Sometimes the satisfaction about results doesn't eliminate discomfort about methods. Patterson agreed. That's exactly right. I've spent 32 years thinking about this operation. I'm still not sure how I feel about it morally. I'm sure it worked. I'm sure it saved lives. I'm not sure that makes it clearly right. They corresponded until Schmidt died in 1989 at age 76. Patterson died in 1995 at age 85. His obituary in the Toronto Star mentioned his long teaching career at the University of Toronto and his service in military intelligence during World War II, but did not mention Operation Mincemeat because Patterson had never publicly discussed his role. The obituary was brief and would not have indicated to readers that the deceased had played any role in one of the war's most famous deception operations. The lesson from Operation Mincemeat is not primarily about deception tactics or intelligence operations. It is about the relationship between meticulous preparation and operational success. The operation succeeded because every detail of Major William Martin's identity was created with extraordinary care. The uniform was authentic. The ID was authentic.
The love letters sounded real because they included mundane details real letters would include. The theatre tickets and engagement ring receipt were genuine items obtained from actual establishments. The briefcase documents were written in authentic bureaucratic style by people who wrote such documents regularly. This attention to detail made the deception nearly undetectable. German intelligence analysts found nothing suspicious because nothing was suspicious at the technical level. The only way to detect the deception was to imagine that British intelligence would go to extraordinary lengths to create a completely fictional identity for a corpse. Most intelligence analysts wouldn't imagine this because it seemed absurdly elaborate. The Germans didn't imagine it. They analyzed the evidence they found, concluded it was authentic, and made strategic decisions based on that conclusion. Those decisions were wrong, but they were based on reasonable analysis of deceptive evidence. The ethical questions about using Glyndor Michael's body remain unresolved. Michael died accidentally. He had no family to consent to his body's use. British intelligence used his body to save thousands of Allied soldiers. This achieved a good result through ethically questionable means. The result doesn't erase the ethical question. The ethical question doesn't negate the result. Both exist simultaneously without clean resolution. Patterson's years of preparation analyzing Major Martin's fabricated identity gave him unique insight into the operation's success. He had examined every receipt, every letter, every personal item, and asked himself, would this fool German counterintelligence? The answer was yes, because the items weren't just authentic looking, they were actually authentic. The receipts were real receipts from real establishments. The letters were written by someone who could write convincing love letters. The photograph was an actual photograph.
The only fictional element was Major Martin himself. Everything about him was real, except his existence. That paradox made the deception work. How do you detect a fictional person when everything about them is authentic except the person himself? Patterson carried this knowledge for 52 years. He knew how the deception was built, detail by detail. He knew why it worked. He knew it saved thousands of lives. He also knew it used a dead vagrant without consent. All of these facts coexisted. Patterson never resolved them into simple moral categories. The operation was simultaneously brilliant, effective, necessary, and ethically troubling. Sometimes that's what warfare produces. Operations that save lives through methods that raise ethical questions. And both facts matter equally, and neither fact makes the other fact less important.